Hello, welcome to my vampire book club. It is untitled, but I like this nonsense one I made up. Let's see, what was it? She doesn't even vamp here. Another Mean Girls reference. I like it because it's nonsense. She doesn't even vamp here, book club. Oh my god, I'm so tired. It's not even that funny. I've had a crazy 2 weeks, really busy for me, and it is just catching up. I'm gonna try my best to, not mess up or fall asleep. If it sounds like I am, I'm sorry, but hey, whatever. I'm still here for the vampires. It's not gonna keep me away. Okay. So, for our book club, we are still reading the Mammoth Book of Vampire Stories by Women, edited by Stephen Jones. We're almost halfway, actually. Page count-wise, this story we're going to start, I believe, or maybe the next one is going to get us halfway. We're on, I think, 21 of 35 stories. Yeah, if you include the intro. And to get started, hold on, let me lower this. Bring up this thingy. Get ready. Come on, do what I want. Okay. The first story is The Haunted House by E. Nesbit, which it turns out was originally published in 1913, so that's fun. Everything else has been like a 2000s, maybe 1980s to 2000s. It's pretty rare to get anything before the 1950s, and by a woman. That's cool. Okay. They usually include like a little blurb, but this one doesn't, probably because, they weren't like interviewing her about her work or anything back then. People who wrote these stories were like pulp authors nobody cared about. Oh well. Okay. It was by the merest accident that Desmond ever went to the haunted house. He had been away from England for 6 years, and the 9 months' leave taught him how easily one drops out of one's place. He had taken rooms at the Greyhound before he found that there was no reason why he should stay in Elmstead rather than in any other of London's dismal outposts. He wrote to all the friends whose addresses he could remember and settled himself to await their answers. He wanted someone to talk to, and there was no one. Meantime, he lounged on the horsehair sofa with the advertisements, and his pleasant gray eyes followed line after line with intolerable boredom. Then, suddenly, hello. It's like not hello, it's just nonsense, whatever. He said, and sat up. This is what he read. A haunted house. Advertiser is anxious to have phenomena investigated. Any properly accredited investigator will be given full facilities. Address by letter only, Weldon Prior, 237 Museum Street, London. That's rum, he said. Weldon Prior had been the best wicket-keeper in his club. It wasn't a common name. Anyway, it was worth trying, so he sent off a telegram. Weldon Prior, 237 Museum Street, London. May I come to you for a day or two and see the ghost? William Desmond. On returning the next day from a stroll, there was an orange envelope on the wide Pembroke table in his parlor. Delighted. Expect you today. Book to Crittendom from Charing Cross wire train. Weldon Prior, Ormahurst Rectory, Kent. So that's all right, said Desmond, and went off to pack his bag and ask in the bar for a timetable. Good old Wilton. It will be ripping, seeing him again. A curious little omnibus, rather like a bathing machine, was waiting outside Crittenden station, and its driver, a swarthy, blunt-faced little man, with liquid eyes, said, "You a friend of Mr. Prior, sir?" Shut him up in the bathing machine and banged the door on him. It was a very long drive and less pleasant than it would have been in an open carriage. The last part of the journey was through a wood, then came a churchyard and a church. and the bathing machine turned in at a gate under heavy trees and drew up in front of a white house with bare, gaunt windows. Oh, I forgot. I wanted to change. See, I got it all set up. I have a new little background photo I'm proud of. God, where was I? Cheerful place, upon my soul, Desmond told himself as he tumbled out of the back of the bathing machine. The driver set his bag on the discolored doorstep and drove off. Desmond pulled a rusty chain, and a big-throated bell jangled above his head. Nobody came to the door, and he rang again. Still nobody came, but he heard a window thrown open above the porch. He stepped back on the gravel and looked up. A young man with rough hair and pale eyes was looking out. Not Wilden, nothing like Wilden. He did not speak, but he seemed to be making signs, and the signs seemed to mean, "Go away." I came to see Mr. Pryor, said Desmond. Instantly and softly the window closed. Is it a lunatic asylum I've come to by chance? Desmond asked himself and pulled again on the rusty chain. Steps sounded inside the house, the sound of boots on stone. Bolts were short back, the door opened, and Desmond, rather hot and a little annoyed, found himself looking into a pair of very dark, friendly eyes. And a very pleasant voice said, "Mr. Desmond, I presume? Do come in and let me apologize." The speaker shook him warmly by the hand, and he found himself following down a flagged passage, a man of more than mature age, well-dressed, handsome, with an air of competence and alertness which we associate with what is called a man of the world. He opened a door and led the way into a shabby, bookish, leathery room. "Do sit down, Mr. Desmond. This must be the uncle, I suppose," Desmond thought, as he fitted himself into the shabby, perfect curves of the armchair. "How's Wilden?" he asked aloud. "All right, I hope." The other man looked at him. "I beg your pardon," he said doubtfully. "I was asking how Wilden is." "I am quite well, I thank you," said the other man with some formality. "I beg your pardon." It was now Desmond's turn to say it. "I did not realize that your name might be Wilden, too. I meant Wilden Pryor." "I am Wilden Pryor," said the other. "And you, I presume, are the expert from the Physical Society?" Psychical Society. Psychical. What a weird word. "Good Lord, no," said Desmond. "I am Wilden Pryor's friend, and, of course, there must be two Wilden Pryors. You sent the telegram? You are Mr. Desmond. The Psychical Society were to send an expert, and I thought—" "I see," said Desmond. "And I thought you were Wilden Pryor, an old friend of mine." "A young man," he said, and half rose. "Now don't," said Wilden Pryor. "No doubt it is my nephew who is your friend. Did he know you were coming? But of course he didn't. I am wondering. But I'm exceedingly glad to see you. You will stay, will you not? If you can endure to be the guest of an old man, and I will write to Will tonight and ask him to join us." "That's most awfully good of you," Desmond assured him. "I shall be glad to stay. I was awfully pleased when I saw Wilden's name in the paper because—" And out came the tale of Elmstead and its loneliness and disappointment. Mr. Pryor listened with the kindest interest. "And you have not found your friends? How sad! But they will write to you. Of course, you left your address." "I didn't, by Jove," said Desmond, "but I can write. Can I catch the post?" "Easily," the elder man assured him. "Write your letters now. My man shall take them to the post, and then we will have dinner, and I will tell you about the ghost." Desmond wrote his letters quickly, Mr. Pryor just then reappearing. "Now, I'll take you to your room," he said, gathering the letters in long white hands. "You'll like a rest. Dinner at 8. The bedchamber, like the parlor, had a pleasant air of worn luxury and accustomed comfort. "I hope you will be comfortable," the host said with courteous solicitude, and Desmond was quite sure that he would. 3 covers were laid. The swarthy man who had driven Desmond from the station stood behind the host's chair, and a figure came towards Desmond and his host from the shadows beyond the yellow circles of the silver-sticked candles. Pause to drink. Of course, I picked up the drink with the screwed-up straw. Just get a different straw. But I'm tired. God, where was I? 3 covers were laid, and the swarthy man, yada yada, candles. "My assistant, Mr. Verney," said the host, and Desmond surrendered his hand to the limp, damp touch of the man who had seemed to say to him from the window of the porch, "Go away." Was Mr. Pryor perhaps a doctor who received paying guests, persons who were, in Desmond's phrase, a bit balmy? But he had said assistant. "I thought," said Desmond hastily, "you would be a clergyman, the rectory, you know. I thought Wilden, my friend Wilden, was staying with an uncle who was a clergyman." "Oh, no," said Mr. Pryor. "I rent the rectory. The rector thinks it is damp. The church is disused, too. It is not considered safe, and they can't afford to restore it. Claret to Mr. Desmond, Lopez." And the swarthy, blunt-faced man filled his glass. "I find this place very convenient for my experiments. I dabble a little in chemistry, Mr. Desmond, and Verney here assists me." Verney murmured something that sounded like "only too proud," and subsided. "We all have our hobbies, and chemistry is mine," Mr. Pryor went on. "Fortunately, I have a little income which enables me to indulge it. Wilden, my nephew, you know, laughs at me and calls it the science of smells, but it's absorbing, very absorbing." After dinner, Verney faded away, and Desmond and his host stretched their feet to what Mr. Pryor called a handful of fire, for the evening had grown chill. "And now," Desmond said, "won't you tell me the ghost story?" The other glanced around the room. "There isn't really a ghost story at all. It's only that—" "Well, it's never happened to me personally, but it happened to Verney, poor lad, and he's never been quite his own self since." Desmond flattered himself on his insight. "Is mine the haunted room?" he asked. "It doesn't come to any particular room," said the other, slowly, "nor to any particular person. Anyone may happen to see it. No one sees it. It isn't the kind of ghost that's seen or heard." "What?" "I'm afraid I'm rather stupid, but I don't understand." "Same," said Desmond roundly. "How can it be a ghost if you neither hear it nor see it?" "I did not say it was a ghost," Mr. Pryor corrected. "I only say that there is something about this house which is not ordinary. Several of my assistants have had to leave. The thing got on their nerves." "What became of the assistants?" asked Desmond. "Oh, they left, you know. They left," Pryor answered vaguely. "One couldn't expect them to sacrifice their health. I sometimes think village gossip is a deadly thing, Mr. Desmond. That perhaps they were prepared to be frightened, that they fancy things. I hope that Psychical Society's expert won't be a neurotic, but even without being a neurotic, one might. But you don't believe in ghosts, Mr. Desmond. Your Anglo-Saxon common sense forbids it." "Oh, hello. I just noticed your comment, so of course I have to stop to look at it." "You didn't, it's only been like a couple pages. You just showed up at a haunted house." Wherever the heck I was. Oh, you know, they left." "What became of the assistants?" asked Desmond, and I'm sorry if I'm repeating myself. "Your Anglo-Saxon common sense forbids it." "I'm afraid I'm not exactly Anglo-Saxon," said Desmond. "On my father's side, I'm pure Celt, though I know I won't do credit to the race." "And on your mother's side?" Mr. Pryor asked, with extraordinary eagerness, an eagerness so sudden and disproportioned to the question that Desmond stared. A faint touch of resentment as suddenly stirred in him, the first spark of antagonism to his host. "Oh," he said lightly, "I think I must have Chinese blood. I got on so well with the natives in Shanghai, and they tell me I owe my nose to a red Indian great-grandmother." "No Negro blood, I suppose?" the host asked, with almost discourteous insistence. "I don't like where that's going." "Oh, I wouldn't say that," Desmond answered. He meant to say it laughing, but he didn't. "My hair, you know. It's a very stiff curl it's got, and my mother's people were in the West Indies a few generations ago. You're interested in distinctions of race, I take it?" Not at all, Mr. Pryor surprisingly assured him. "But, of course, any details of your family are necessarily interesting to me, I feel," he added, with another of his winning smiles, "that you and I are already friends." Desmond could not have reasoningly defended the faint quality of dislike that had begun to tinge his first pleasant sense of being welcomed and wished for as a guest. "You're very kind," he said. "It's jolly of you to take in a stranger like this." Mr. Pryor smiled, handed him the cigar box, mixed whiskey and soda, and began to talk about the history of the house. The foundations are almost certainly 13th century. It was a priory, you know. There's a curious tale, by the way, about the man Henry gave it to when he smashed up the monasteries. There was a curse. There seems always to have been a curse. The gentle, pleasant, high-bred voice went on. Desmond thought he was listening, but presently he roused himself and dragged his attention back to the words that were being spoken. That made the fifth death, ... There is one every 100 years, and always in the same mysterious way. Then he found himself on his feet, incredibly sleepy, and heard himself say, "These old stories are tremendously interesting. Thank you very much. I hope you won't think me very uncivil, but I think I'd rather like to turn in. I feel a bit tired somehow." "But of course, my dear chap." Mr. Pryor saw Desmond to his room. "Got everything you want?" "Right. Lock the door if you should feel nervous, of course. A lock can't keep ghosts out, but I always feel as if it could." And with another of those pleasant, friendly laughs, he was gone. William Desmond went to bed a strong young man, sleepy indeed beyond his experience of sleepiness, but well and comfortable. He awoke faint and trembling, lying deep in the billows of the feather bed, and lukewarm waves of exhaustion swept through him. Where was he? What had happened? His brain, dizzy and weak at first, refused him any answer. When he remembered the abrupt spasm of repulsion which he had felt so suddenly and unreasonably the night before came back to him in a hot, breathless flush. He had been drugged. He had been poisoned. "I must get out of this," he told himself, and blundered out of the bed toward the silken bell-pull that he had noticed the night before hanging near the door. As he pulled it, the bed and the wardrobe in the room rose up round him and fell on him, and he fainted. When he next knew anything, someone was putting brandy to his lips. He saw Pryor, the kindest concern in his face, the assistant, pale and watery-eyed, the swarthy manservant, stolid, silent, and expressionless. He heard Verney say to Pryor, "You see, it was too much. I told you." "Hush," said Pryor. "He's coming too." I'm gonna pause to drink something. Need the little mind breaks. 4 days later, Desmond, lying on a wicker chair on the lawn, was a little disinclined for exertion, but no longer ill. Nourishing foods and drinks, beef tea, stimulants, and constant care. These had brought him back to something like his normal state. He wondered at the vague suspicions, vaguely remembered, of the first night. They had all been proved absurd by the unwavering care and kindness of everyone in the haunted house. "But what caused it?" he asked his host for the 50th time. "What made me make such a fool of myself?" And this time Mr. Pryor did not put him off, as he had always done before, by begging him to wait till he was stronger. "I am afraid, you know," he said, "that the ghost really did come to you. I am inclined to revise my opinion of the ghost." "But why didn't it come again?" "I have been with you every night, you know," his host reminded him, and, indeed, the sufferer had never been left alone since the ringing of his bell on that terrible first morning. "And now," Mr. Pryor went on, "if you will not think me inhospitable, I think you will be better away from here. You ought to go to the seaside." "There haven't been any letters for me, I suppose," Desmond said a little wistfully. "Just want to a little break to say, I wish somebody would send me to the seaside." "No one, I suppose. You gave the right address? Amherst Rectory, Crittenden, Kent?" "I don't think I put Crittenden," Desmond said. "I copied the address from your telegram." He pulled the pink paper from his pocket. "Ah, that would account," said the other. "You've been most awfully kind all through," said Desmond abruptly. "Nonsense, my boy," said the elder man benevolently. "I only wish Willie had been able to come. He's never written, the rascal, nothing but the telegram to say he could not come and was writing." "I suppose he's having a jolly time somewhere," said Desmond, enviously. "But look here, do tell me about the ghost, if there's anything to tell. I'm almost quite well now, and I should like to know what it was that made a fool of me like that." "Well," Mr. Pryor looked round him at the gold and red of dahlias and sunflowers, gay in the September sunshine. "Here and now, I don't know that it could do any harm. You remember that story of a man who got this place from Henry VIII in the curse? That man's wife is buried in a vault under the church. Well, There were legends, and I confess I was curious to see her tomb. There are iron gates to the vault. Locked they were. I opened them with an old key, and I couldn't get them to shut again. Yes, Desmond said. You think I might have sent for a locksmith, but the fact is, there is a small crypt to the church, and I have used that crypt as a supplementary laboratory. If I had called anyone in to see to the lock, they would have gossiped. I should have been turned out of my laboratory, perhaps out of my house. Why do I keep saying it like Dexter? Laboratory. Omelette du fromage. I see. Now, the curious thing is, Mr. Pryor went on, lowering his voice, that it is only since that grating was opened that this house has been what they call haunted. It is since then that all the things have happened. What things? People staying here, suddenly ill, just as you were, and the attacks always seem to indicate loss of blood, and... He hesitated a moment. That wound in your throat. I told you, you had hurt yourself falling when you rang the bell, but that was not true. What is true is that you had on your throat just the same little white wound that all the others have had. I wish, he frowned, that I could get that vault gate shut again. The key won't turn. I wonder if I could do anything, Desmond asked, secretly convinced that he had hurt his throat in falling, and that his host's story was, as he put it, all moonshine. Still, to put a lock right was but a slight return for all the care and kindness. I'm an engineer, you know, he said, awkwardly, and rose. Probably a little oil. Let's have a look at this same lock. He followed Mr. Pryor through the house to the church. A bright, smooth old key turned readily, and they passed into the building, musty and damp, where ivy crawled through the broken windows, and the blue sky seemed to be laid close against the holes in the roof. Another key clicked in the lock of a low door beside what had once been the Lady Chapel. A thick oak door grated back, and Mr. Pryor stopped a moment to light a candle that waited in its rough iron candlestick on a ledge of the stonework. Then down narrow stairs, chipped a little at the edges and soft with dust. The crypt was Norman, very simply beautiful. At the end of it was a recess, masked with a grating of rusty ironwork. That just sounds cool. Man, like a church with a dusty, creepy stair, whatever. It just sounds cool. They used to think, said Mr. Pryor, that iron kept off witchcraft. This is the lock, he went on, holding the candle against the gate, which was ajar. They went through the gate because the lock was on the other side. Desmond worked a minute or two with the oil and feather that he had brought. Then, with a little wrench, the key turned and returned. I think that's all right, he said, looking up, kneeling on one knee with the key still in the lock and his hand on it. May I try it? Mr. Pryor took Desmond's place, turned the key, pulled it out, and stood up. Then the key and the candlestick fell rattling on the stone floor, and the old man sprang upon Desmond. Now I've got you, he growled in the darkness, and Desmond says that his spring and his clutch and his voice were like the spring and the clutch and the growl of a strong, savage beast. Desmond's little strength snapped like a twig at his first bracing of it to resistance. The old man held him as a vice holds. He had got a rope from somewhere. He was tying Desmond's arms. Desmond hates to know that there in the dark he screamed like a caught hare. Then he remembered that he was a man and shouted, "Help! Here! Help!" But a hand was on his mouth, and now a handkerchief was being knotted at the back of his head. He was on the floor, leaning against something. Pryor's hands had left him. Now, said Pryor's voice, a little breathless, and the match he struck showed Desmond the stone shelves with long things on them, coffins, he supposed. Now, I'm sorry I had to do it, but science before friendship, my dear Desmond, he went on, quite courteous and friendly. I will explain to you, and you will see that a man of honor cannot act otherwise. Of course, you having no friends who know where you are is most convenient. I saw that from the start. Now I'll explain. I didn't expect you to understand by instinct, but no matter. I am, I say it, without vanity, the greatest discoverer since Newton. I know how to modify man's nature. I can make men what I choose. It's all done by transfusion of blood. Lopez, you know, my man Lopez. I've pumped the blood of dogs into his veins, and he's my slave, like a dog. Vernie, he's my slave too. Part dog's blood and partly the blood of people who've come from time to time to investigate the ghost. And partly my own, because I wanted him to be clever enough to help me. And there's a bigger thing behind all this. You'll understand me when I say. Here, he became very technical indeed, and used many words that meant nothing to Desmond, whose thoughts dwelled more and more on his small chance of escape. I love when stories do that, where, like, the person is ranting, the other person is like, I'm not listening at all. Sorry, just cutting through the tension. To die like a rat in a hole, if he could only loosen the handkerchief and shout again. Attend, can't you, said Prior savagely, and kicked him. I beg your pardon, my dear chap, he went on suavely, but this is important. So you see, the elixir of life is really the blood. The blood is the life, you know, and my great discovery is that to make a man immortal and restore his youth, one only needs blood from the veins of a man who unites in himself blood of the four great races. The four colors, black, white, red, and yellow. Your blood unites these four. I took as much as I dared from you that night. I was the vampire, you know, he laughed pleasantly. But your blood didn't act. The drug I had to give you to induce sleep probably destroyed the vital germs. And besides, there wasn't enough of it. Now there is going to be enough. Desmond had been working his head against the thing behind him, easing the knot of the handkerchief down till it slipped from head to neck. Now he got his mouth free and said quickly, that was not true, what I said about the Chinamen and that. I was joking. My mother's people were all Devon. I don't blame you in the least, said Prior quietly. I should lie myself in your place. And he put back the handkerchief. The candle was now burning clearly from the place where it stood, on a stone coffin. Desmond could see that the long things on the shelves were coffins, not all of stone. He wondered what this madman would do with his body when everything was over. The little wound in his throat had broken out again. He could feel the slow trickle of warmth on his neck. He wondered whether he would faint. It felt like it. I wish I'd brought you here the first day. It was Vernie's doing. My tinkering about with pints and half pints. Sheer waste. Sheer wanton waste. Prior stopped and stood looking at him. Desmond, despairingly conscious of growing physical weakness, caught himself in a real wonder as to whether this might not be a dream, a horrible, insane dream, and he could not wholly dismiss the wonder, because incredible things seemed to be adding themselves to the real horrors of the situation, just as they do in dreams. There seemed to be something stirring in the place, something that wasn't Prior. No, not Prior's shadow either. That was black and sprawled big across the arched roof. This was white and very small and thin, but it stirred. It grew. Now it was no longer just a line of white, but a long, narrow white wedge, and it showed it between the coffin on the shelf opposite him and that coffin's lid. And still Prior stood very still, looking down on his prey. All motion, but a dull wonder, was now dead in Desmond's weakened senses. In dreams, if one called out, one awoke, but he could not call out. Perhaps if one moved. But before he could bring his enfeebled will to the decision of movement, something else moved. The black lid of the coffin opposite rose slowly, and then suddenly fell, clattering and echoing, and from the coffin rose a form, horribly white and shrouded, and fell on Prior and rolled with him on the floor of the vault in a silent, whirling struggle. The last thing Desmond heard before he fainted in good earnest was the scream Prior uttered as he turned at the crash and saw the white shrouded body leaping towards him. Whew! Oh, my God. It's all right, he heard next, and Vernie was bending over him with brandy. You're quite safe. He's tied up and locked in the laboratory. The laboratory. Jesus Christ. I'm not Dexter. No, that's all right, too. For Desmond's eyes had turned towards the lidless coffin. That was only me. It was the only way I could think of to save you. Can you walk now? Let me help you so. I've opened the grating. Come. More water. Desmond blinked in the sunlight he had never thought to see again. Here he was, back in his wicker chair. He looked at the sundial on the house. The whole thing had taken less than 50 minutes. Tell me, said he, and Vernie told him in short sentences with pauses between. I tried to warn you, he said. You remember, in the window. I really believed in his experiments at first, and he'd found out something about me and not told. It was when I was very young. God knows I've paid for it. And when you came, I'd only just found out what really had happened to the other chaps. That beast Lopez let it out when he was drunk, inhumane brute. And I had a row with Briar that first night, and he promised me he wouldn't touch you, and then he did. You might have told me. You were in a nice state to be told anything, weren't you? He promised me he'd send you off as soon as you were well enough, and he had been good to me. But when I heard him begin about the grating and the key, I knew, so I just got a sheet But why didn't you come out before? I didn't dare. He could have tackled me easily if he had known what he was tackling. He kept moving about. It had to be done suddenly. I counted on just that moment of weakness when he really thought a dead body had come to life to defend you. Now I'm going to harness the horse and drive you to the police station in Crittenden, and they'll send and lock him up. Everyone knew he was as mad as a hatter, but somebody had to be nearly killed before anyone would lock him up. The law's like that, you know. But you, the police, won't they? It's quite safe, said Verney dully. Nobody knows but the old man, and now nobody will believe anything he says. No, he never posted your letters, of course, and he never wrote to your friend, and he put off the psychical man. No, I can't find Lopez. He must know that something's up. He's bolted. But he had not. They found him, stubbornly dumb, but moaning a little, crouching against the locked grating of the vault when they came, a prudent half-dozen of them, to take the old man away from the haunted house. The master was dumb as the man. He would not speak. He has never spoken since. The frailty of old-timey brains. You get a little spooked and you never speak again. What a fun little story. It's loosely about vampires, but I just love the crazy little scientist taking people's blood and being like, oh, you have the blood of 4 races? That means you're the best experiment I could take blood from for some reason. Whatever, that was delightful. And again, it's The Haunted House by E. Nesbit. And it was written in like 1912 or something. I don't know, I thought it was cool. On to the next one. Turkish Delight by Roberta Lannes. Yep. Traditional vampire stories only intrigue me in one way, reveals the author, that being the seduction. Nowadays, even that has been superseded by the impulsive, compulsive vampire of Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Dracula 2000, who attack, drink, and run. I wanted to write something more subtle, more about the vampires we meet in our everyday lives. Those that take something vital to ourselves against our will, yet by seduction or manipulation are far more real and frightening than the bloodsuckers. In the following tale, Andrew has something of value to himself and to those whose lives are empty of that which keeps us delighted and full of wonder. I liken Andrew to a Turkish delight, merely a chocolate sweet without its prized, aromatic, succulent rose jelly inside, and so a vampire story was born. I don't think I've ever had a Turkish delight. I don't know if I would sell my soul in the entire world for one. And, I'm not going to write this off before I even start it, but I like traditional vampire stories. I think when you get subtle, you have the risk of being too subtle, and then it's just, vaguely a metaphor. And it's no, I want the dude attacking me with his teeth. Whatever. All right. The walk home from school took Andrew up Long Row to Green Street, where he lived with his mother and an Aunt Molly. 2 doors down from Andrew's house was an old nailer's cottage. Tourists sometimes stopped to look into its dusty windows and see the old tools and furnishings of the 18th century nail-maker's shop. It had little historical interest to tourists, what with the famous mill in the same town, but once in a while someone other than the school children who'd learned of it in school stopped by. Today, as Andrew trudged up the cobbled road, he saw an unfamiliar old man and a boy about his own age staring into the cottage window. They had the look of tourists, with cameras slung around their necks, small clean backpacks, and hiking boots that still looked new, stiff and uncomfortable. When they heard Andrew's footsteps, they turned. The boy was pretty, Andrew thought, almost like a girl. His dark hair was cut graggly so that it fell over his eyes and ears in a fashionable way. His eyes were large, round, and luminous on his pale face. He didn't smile. The man had small eyes, very light in color, almost like pale aquamarine quartz, and large, fuzzy eyebrows, just like Andrew's granddad. He was tall and thin, with a long, flat nose and around, very thin lips, the skin wrinkled in vertical ravines, reminding Andrew of a cartoon skull. "Do you live around here, son?" The man spoke as the boy turned his stare back into the cottage. He had an accent, German or Danish. Andrew wasn't good at telling one accent from another unless it was American, Spanish, or French. Oh my God, when I was a kid, I thought everything was Spanish. Like everything. Andrew frowned at the man and continued walking. It didn't occur to Andrew to walk past his house that day and turn onto another street, but later he would think about how different things would have been if he had. He walked right up to the door, eyes still on the tourists, turned the doorknob and went in. "That must be Andy. Guess what your Aunt Molly made?" The air was full of the aroma of butter, flour, and currants. "You made scones, Auntie. I could smell them outside." Andrew set down his book bag and took off his blazer and cap. "Go up and change your clothes, Andy, then come down and have one before they cool down." There wasn't much better than warm Molly scones and a cup of cocoa. He hurried upstairs and changed into a sweatshirt and jeans. As he put his school shoes on the chair by the window, he looked down at the Naylor's cottage. The old man had stepped away from the building into the street and was staring right up at Andrew's window. At Andrew. He thought of the scones, the hot cocoa, of his aunt waiting downstairs, but somehow he found the stranger's curious stare compelling. Then the man smiled. His teeth were very straight, large and white. Like chiclets, Andrew thought, like dice without dots. "What's taking you, Andy? The scones are cooling." His aunt was at his door, her graying yellow apron smeared with the byproducts of baking. He spun around, startled. "Oh, Auntie, I didn't hear you coming up the stairs. What's out there so interesting you reckon it's worth more than a warm scone or two?" She came up beside him and looked out the window. Andrew looked as well. Nothing. No one was there. The street was deserted. "I saw some tourists looking in the cottage, and the old one tried to talk to me. You didn't speak with him, did you? You know what your mom says. One doesn't speak to strangers. Look what happened to Wally Burdock and Gwen Shafford. They talked to strangers, and both of them ended up DEA dead. Dead." Well, Andrew thought, that wasn't... Wait. Did I just say DEA dead? There was a D in there. Oh my God. Whatever. Well, Andrew thought that wasn't quite true. Wally, who was 17 and in trouble with local thugs all the time, was beaten with a bat until he had terrible brain damage, and his folks let the hospital take him off life support. Then he died. And Gwen was assaulted by her stepbrother and went crazy. She was in some asylum or hospital somewhere. Still, he knew what his mom meant. She'd stopped to talk with a stranger once, and the next thing she knew, after 3 weeks of romance, bingo, bango, no more stranger. Andrew was the result of that fiasco. I know. I gave a good frown and came right in. He sniffed at the air. "I must have smelled them scones anyway, 'cause nothing ever stops me from coming in when you're baking." His aunt grinned. "Well then, let's have one, and I'll make you a cup of cocoa. It's getting cold outside." I am so dehydrated. Andrew followed her down the narrow stairs through the tiny kitchen. He sat down to wait. Aunt Molly had her set ways of doing things, and there would be no impatient grabbing or rushing her. She busied herself with canisters, spoons, and a pan of milk. "Tell me what you did today." "Maths. We worked on problems. Lucky for me, they're really easy." "They are. Well then, give me one and see if I can do it. It's been 30 years since I did any maths, but I'm still pretty smart for an old lady." "You're not old, Auntie. Mom is older than you, and she's still young. She says so all the time." His mouth watered at the smell of the cocoa stirred in the hot milk. His aunt set the cup before him, then went to the counter for a scone. He watched as she broke open the dusky the dusty, cream-colored mass, and steam rolled out into the warm kitchen. Give me a problem then, Andy. See if I can do it. She sat across from him, eager for his usual reaction to her scones. A bit annoyed at having to speak when he wanted to eat, he licked his lips and stared at his scone. All right, Auntie, if a train travels at 50 miles per hour and it took the train 4 hours and 10 minutes to get from London to Newcastle, what is the distance from London to Newcastle? Oh my, that is a tough one. Let me think. She scratched her head and wrinkled her mouth in concentration. Do you know the answer? Andrew nodded. Do you? He bit into the scone. It was almost too good. He swooned. Well, 218 miles, give or take a few miles. Yes? It's got a decimal figure in it, but you're close. That's really good, Auntie. They heard a key in the lock. That'll be your mum. We should ask her to solve one of your problems. Andrew's mother came in with her arms full of groceries. Come help. Mum, my scone's getting cold. His aunt put her hands on his shoulders. You stay here, Andy. I'll get them. He grinned up at his aunt, then took a swig of the cocoa. She always made it a bit too rich, just the way he liked it. While his mum and aunt put away groceries, Andrew thought about the pretty boy and the old man he'd seen. He wondered why the man had spoken to him, why the boy seemed so sad. Why would he want to know if Andrew lived nearby? What could he have wanted? There was just an accident at the Triangle, I heard in Safeway. Young boy crossing with his granddad. Got hit by a lorry. Andrew spun around in his chair. Just now? Just a few minutes ago. Didn't you hear the siren? I was going to go have a look, but I have frozen puddings in my bags. What, you think you know who it might have been? May I go look, please? I might know him. I might. His mother looked to his aunt and back to him. His aunt was the lenient one, overfeeding and overloving him, while his mother was bitter and restrictive. His aunt gave his mum a pleading look. Sometimes it works, and sometimes it didn't. Finish the scone and cocoa, then you and your Aunt Molly can go take a look while I start supper. Me? You want me to go with him? Bernadette, I look like I've been in all day cleaning, which I have. Can he go on his own? It's almost dark. Please, Mom, I just want to take a look. I won't stay. Really, I promise. You'll wear a coat? Yeah, I will. Promise. Go then, but don't dawdle. Andrew grabbed the unfinished scone and ran upstairs to get a jacket. He knew it was the pretty boy, just knew. It could be any one of the boys he knew, but there was more of a reason for a stranger to be hit. The Triangle confused tourists. They often got caught out in the traffic. He hoped that the boy wasn't hurt too badly. He shouted goodbye to his mom and aunt as he raced out the front door. Oh, halfway. There it is. The halfway page count. He ran down Green Street to Bridge Street until he reached the Triangle. There were 2 police cars and a casualty van. The crowd was large and traffic backed up Bridge Street as far as he could see in both directions. Frank Delaney rushed over when he saw Andrew at the edge of the crowd. Did you see it happen? Frank shivered in just a football jersey. You mean the accident? No, my mom just told me about it. She heard about it in Safeway. Did you see? No, damn it. I was doing my report for old Naughty Bennett. Do you know who do you think it was? Andrew rose up on his toes as the attendants lifted the stretcher into the van. The body was entirely covered by a sheet. Dunno, he's dead. Can't see his face. His throat was tight and his eyes burned to cry. A great time to drink more water. Oh my God. Dead kid. As he surveyed the crowd, Andrew saw the old man with a police officer, his bony hand over his face, hiding his tears, shaking his head. When he took his hand away from his face to get a handkerchief, he turned to look right at Andrew as if he knew the boy was there. His eyes lingered on him until Andrew felt his stomach clench. Then the old man turned back to the police officer and blew his nose. I hate missing all the blood and guts, Frank complained. Bet it's somebody from school, probably that big baby, Tim Broadbank. His mom won't let him cross the street without holding her hand still. He's a year ahead of us, you know. Well, then if he got hit by a car, then his mom was right, and he's too stupid to cross the street without his mom. Okay? Are you happy? Are you happy, Frank? Tim? No, don't think so. I saw a boy with his grandkid an hour ago by my house. They were standing at the Naylor's cottage. The granddad was right over there with the police crying his bloody eyes out. It had to be his grandson. Do you know them? Frank rubbed his hands together. Andrew shook his head. Tourists. They had the look. Just think, you go on a trip with your granddad and end up going home in a coffin. That's a sodding awful vacation if I ever heard. Andrew couldn't take his eyes off the old man. Frank went on talking, but he didn't really hear. The old man didn't look at him again, but Andrew watched for his eyes to wash over him again. He shivered. So they stuck these big pins in his eyes. Pins, he turned to see Frank going on. Hey, Frank, I had better get on. Supper will be ready, and my mom wasn't happy to let me come out here as it was. I want to hear the rest of Frank's story. What do you mean, pins in his eyes? Yeah, well, all right. If I find anything out, I'll tell you Monday. See you. Right. See you. He gave the old man one more lingering glance, then walked away. Just as Andrew turned up Green Street, thinking of his supper, the old man searched the crowd. Andrew's legs felt leaden as he trudged up his street. He wanted to go to the old man and comfort him. Even as he felt it, he knew it was unreasonable. He didn't know the stranger about who everything seemed suspiciously odd. As he reached his door, he wondered if he had just spoken to the old man, kept them a few minutes more, the boy might not have been killed. The next morning, Andrew grabbed up the Belper News from the doorstep. He was certain there would be a report of the accident, not much qualified as news in town. This was front page stuff, and there it was. Visitor accident by Rosalie Bishop. A man in his 10-year-old ward traveled through England, stopped in Belper on their way to Matlock Baths. At approximately 5 p.m., they were crossing at the triangle near the Mill Park when a lorry, on its way to Derby, hit the boy who was killed on impact. The two visitors were unfamiliar with the traffic patterns in that area, and the boy stepped out in front of the lorry. The driver was not at fault in this tragic accident. The boy's guardian plans to return to his native Turkey within the week. Local families have rallied to give the man a place to stay and meals until his plane departs from Heathrow on Thursday. Anyone interested in giving aid or expressing sympathies can contact Elizabeth Horner at the Methodist Chapel. Chuck. Andrew was now more curious than before. Turkey. He'd never much thought about people living there, though he'd heard of it in geography. What he did know was that he loved Turkish delight. The rosy jelly center with the yummy chocolate all around made him think of the occasional bouts of happiness his mother had when she bought them a bag of sweets, always with some Turkish delight for Andrew. Did Turkish delight originate in Turkey? Was the jelly part Turkish or the chocolate or both? For once, he couldn't wait for Monday. He'd go straight to the school library after class. Adorable. The library was a small room that had once been a supply cabinet and coat room. Books lined every wall, and two half-sized bookcases divided the room. Paintings done by the infants covered the wall over the librarian's desk. Andrew loved the smell of the books and the ancient oiled tables where students could read. The library was empty except for Miss Eklund, a woman the kids called the Swede. She was in her 50s, wore her hair clipped short, had funny little hairs on her chin, and smelled of men's aftershave. The Swede was actually a wrestler, and Miss Eklund had a stocky build like a man, hence the moniker. She let the girls get away with murder and slapped the back of the boys' heads if they spoke. Good for her. Gatekeep, girl boss, librarian. He had a book on Turkey where Frank appeared around the corner. He grabbed at Andrew's sleeve to see the book. He scanned it, then looked over at Miss Eklund, who was deep into stamping loan cards. Hey, you get in trouble when you got in Friday? Nah. You? Hell no. Nobody comes home until late at my house. My dad goes straight to the pub from work, and my mom, ... Well, she's with her friends a lot. Nick's living with his girlfriend in Sheffield now, so it's just me. Did you see anything after I left? Frank took the book on Turkey from Andrew's hand. Hey, did you know that the old guy is from Turkey? I was standing there while this lady was asking him about the kid. Andrew put the book under his arm. Yeah? Really? What'd you hear? I read the newspaper, but it didn't say much. He was staying at the Hollingshead Hotel. The kid wasn't his grandson, but a friend of the family. He was taking the kid to the baths because he had some kind of illness, leukemia or something. Hell, the baths don't do anything, and anybody who knows something knows that. It's just a tourist attraction. A joke, really. Wow, I saw the kid. He looked sad or sick, weak-like. Maybe he was going to die anyway. Andrew watched Frank's face grow more animated. God, Frank is a weirdo. Or maybe the old guy pushed the kid in front of the lorry to make sure he didn't suffer. Hey, that would be sinister, like when... Miss Eklund drifted over to the boys. You two want to make conversation, do it outside. This is a library. We don't converse in the library. Frank winked at Andrew and fled. Andrew checked the book out to take home, and that's my cue for more liquid. Frank wasn't in school the next day. Andrew wanted to share his discoveries about Turkey with him, not that it was the kind of thing Frank would have wanted to know. Turkey was right near Russia. It had the Black Sea on one side and the Mediterranean on the other. The country had its own language called Turkish. He hadn't gone far enough in the book to learn if Turkish delight came from Turkey, though. He also read that they had bad earthquakes there. Maybe Frank would find all the deaths that came from their earthquakes interesting. That was the kind of thing he found fascinating. On his way home, he stopped by Frank's. Mrs. Delaney answered the door. "Is Frank at home?" Her face screwed up, and she leaned over to put her nose about an inch from Andrew's. She stank of brandy. "Well, now, he's supposed to be with you, Mr. Andrew Crawford. So I should be asking you just that thing. He told me he was going to meet you on the tarmac, and you were both going to the church to see about helping that old man." "To the church?" Andrew tried to recall which church that might be. "Well, I must have got it wrong, Mrs. Delaney. I thought we were meeting here. I'd better get on to the church then, hadn't I?" He smiled sheepishly. "You two aren't cooking something up together, are you?" "No, Mrs. Delaney. We honestly want to make the man feel better. His kid was about our age, and we just thought..." "How nice. You had better get going, Andrew. It'll be dark soon." She shut the door before he could reply. Why hadn't Frank told him he was going to the church? And which church? He couldn't recall. He walked down to the Catholic church, which was closest, and looked for someone to help him. A washerwoman told him the old man was staying with a family up by Strutt's school. The Methodist chapel was where they were coordinating aid for the Turkish man. He thanked the woman and started off in the direction of Strutt's. It occurred to him that his Aunt Molly would be sick with worry if he didn't stop home first, but then he risked being told he couldn't go at all. It was a long walk down to Strutt's. The only way to get there before dark would be to take a bus. He checked for change in his pocket and raced to the bus stop where a bus had just pulled up. It was the number 14 that stopped right across from the Methodist chapel at the bus station. Just his luck. Though the bus was crowded, he got a seat by the window behind the driver. He watched the people walking determinedly up and down the streets, the cars moving ever so slowly in the traffic of the A6. Another bus crawled along, going in the opposite direction. They were across from each other at one point. Andrew stared into the other bus, scanning the faces. He stopped at the old man, the one he had seen by the cottage. He was sitting with his arm around another boy, smiling his dicey smile, and listening to the boy's animated chatter. Andrew felt a flurry of butterflies on his belly before he really looked at the boy, knowing anyway that it was Frank Delaney. Andrew spun in his seat, hands to the windows, and shouted Frank's name. "Frank! Frank!" "Oh, no." The bus driver asked Andrew to quiet down, but Andrew had already gone silent. He kept his eyes on the bus as it ambled on in the other direction. He wasn't certain, but he thought that for a second the old man looked right at him. He got off at King Street and walked back up towards home. When he told his mom and auntie what was going on, they would understand why he was late. He hoped so. Nothing else had gone right that day. "It's none of your business what that Frank Delaney does with his life, Andy. If he wants to run off with the Queen, he can, but you have your own life to live." "Okay." His mother started on him before dinner, and it was now his bedtime. His auntie had listened carefully and said, "What a shame." But when his mom came home, Molly retold Andrew's story with unusual histrionics. She used expressions like kidnapped and pedophile, working his mom into a frantic state. Maybe I should try saying that like the British people, but I don't want to. I know I will. It will be terrible. "And if he was kidnapped, all the better than when you keep away from that boy." Wait. "And if he was kidnapped, all the better then that you keep away from that boy. Frank finds trouble where there isn't any. Isn't that right, Molly?" Aunt Molly was wringing her hands and nodding. "At least the authorities know who he is and where he's staying. That old man isn't going to get far." Andrew's mom made moaning noises in her throat. "Let's call the police. It can't hurt. If it's innocent, then we'll just feel like fools. But if Frank was kidnapped, they'll be glad of our call." As his mom and auntie got on the phone, Andrew sneaked out the back door. He had to get over to Frank's. The bus had been going in the direction of his house. It could all have been innocent, couldn't it? This time, when Mrs. Delaney answered the front door, a strange man barked from upstairs to get back to him. She looked disheveled in her bathrobe, and her face flushed in the light of the foyer. What's it now? You get it wrong again? Were you supposed to meet up at school then? You mean Frank's not here? She shuddered at his anxious tone. No, Frank is not here. What's going on, Andrew Crawford? Andrew looked down at his feet. I think he's gone off with someone. I saw him on the bus with the old man whose ward was killed at the Triangle last week. I thought maybe they were coming here. Though she looked a bit panicked, Mrs. Delaney held her robe shut at her throat and said, Frankie does as he pleases. He's tough enough to take care of himself. I'll worry if he don't come home for days. He's like his brother that way. The man's voice came from upstairs again, more insistent this time. Mrs. Delaney lowered her voice to Andrew. Don't you worry, Andrew Crawford. Frankie's all right. Go home. Then she shut the door on him again. He ran home, hoping his mom and auntie were consumed by the police and hadn't noticed he'd gone, but there they were, in the street. A police van pulled up to the house, 2 coppers talking to them. Where the hell did you go, you stupid, stupid boy? His mother grabbed his arm and yanked him into the house. You knew you'd scare me to death, didn't you? She was slapping at him. He kept his arms up as she flailed. How dare you? His Aunt Molly came in with the police officers and shouted for her sister to stop. One of the police officers grabbed at his mum. His Aunt Molly swept him into her arms. Mrs., it's no good hitting the boy. Stop. Relax. We'll talk to him. Bernadette, go upstairs and wash your face in cold water. I'll talk with Andy and the police. Go on. His mum ripped herself from the policeman's grasp and growled, foam at the corners of her mouth. You'll do no such thing. He's my son. I'll deal with him. The constable shook his head. Mrs., do as your sister says. You take this into your own hands, you'll be leaving with us. Andrew tried not to cry, but he couldn't stop himself. He was more afraid than he was sad, but tears came anyway. Look what you've done, Bernadette. Andrew's in tears. Go upstairs. Go. Now. His mother stomped upstairs, but he knew she wouldn't wash her face or anything. She'd stew in her rage until she couldn't stand it any longer and come hit him again. His auntie tried to stop it, but she didn't have any place else to live, so she turned away when she failed. Andrew felt sorry for her, thankful that at least she tried. One of the police officers sat down beside Andrew and asked him 100 questions. Or so it seemed. It was past his bedtime and he was beginning to fall asleep. When the man decided he had enough information, he told Andrew they were going to go by the Delaney's house. Then the constable asked if Andrew felt safe enough to stay in his house, that they had somewhere else he could stay. It'll be all right. She gets upset easily, and she always cools down. Besides, I have my auntie. Aunt Molly grinned from across the room. Okay, then. But you call us if things get heated again. Don't be afraid. The police officer looked at Aunt Molly, then back to Andrew. We'll let you know what our investigation turns up. Yes, please, Andrew managed, his eyelids sagging, body limp. Last thing he heard was his auntie opening the blanket closet to get him an extra bit of warmth. God, that poor kid. When Andrew awoke, he knew half the day had gone. Though it was gray out, he could tell by the angle of the light in his room. His mom was off at work, surely, and his auntie was probably cleaning someone's house since it was Wednesday. He dressed in his school clothes and went down to the kitchen. His auntie was sitting at the table having lunch. Ah, well, look who finally got himself up. Did you sleep all right? Yes, Aunt Molly. I don't remember going up to bed, though. Is Mom all right? One of those nice policemen carried you up. You fell asleep before they reached the door, and I knew I'd never get you up those stairs alone. Is Mom okay? What do you care? She beats you terribly and wails into the night about how awful you are to make her worry. She doesn't deserve you, Andy. She was too young to have a child alone in the first place. It should have been me. I'm a better mom to you than she is. She stopped, looking away from Andrew. I'm sorry. I know you love your mom. Sometimes I can't help myself. The truth slips out. Forgive me. I love you too, Aunt Molly. Don't be mad at Mom. She's unhappy. His auntie smirked at him. She and all the rest of us miserable old women. You're not old. She looked Andrew over. You think you can go to school now? He looked at the clock over the sink. It was nearly noon. 4 more classes after midday. Yeah, I'm okay now. Are you cleaning today? Aunt Molly set a sack on the table. Here's a sandwich then. There's a note inside, but I'll telephone the school and let them know you're on your way. And yes, not a day goes by I don't have a house to clean. I've got a cancellation today, that's all. Thanks, Annie. You're the best. Oh, Andrew stopped at the door as his auntie spoke. Your friend Frank is fine. You'll see him in school, I'd wager. Thanks. Andrew closed the door too hard, but he hardly heard it. He ran to school, anxious to learn what had happened to Frank. Oh my God, this poor kid. He caught up with Frank on his way to class. When he saw Andrew, his friend frowned. What, you mad at me? You pissed off my mom, you stupid idiot. She told me to get lost after school because she was entertaining her friends. So I told her I was meeting you at the church. She just guessed we was going to visit that old guy. You really ruined it for me. When the police showed up, she got even angrier. Don't you get it? Can't you be cool? Andrew was speechless. Wouldn't Frank have done the same for him if he'd seen Andrew on the bus with the old man? Wouldn't Frank have suspected something was up with the old man being friendly to another boy right after his ward died? Frank walked off. Nothing bad had happened to Frank, and that was good, but couldn't he see that Andrew's concern was heartfelt and real? Couldn't he understand that? He hadn't meant to make Mrs. Delaney angry. Andrew did his best not to cry. He hung his head and shoulders as he went to class. Poor kid. He was listless the rest of his day in school. He questioned everything from the moment he saw the old man at the Naylor's cottage with his ward. Were all the strange things he saw and felt just his imagination? Didn't it seem odd that the old man stayed around Belper after the accident, that he seemed happy and chatty on the bus with Frank? It was creepy, very creepy. All the way home, Andrew kept his head down, watching his feet as he went. When he got there, his mother was remote, ashamed of her behavior, but unable or refusing to apologize and make it up to Andrew. His auntie was quiet, on edge that she'd set off her sister. He felt very alone. Up in his room, after he did his homework, Andrew sat in his window staring down at the Naylor's cottage. Growing up, he often sat there, wondering what the street looked like 200 years ago, before, when the nailer was busy making his nails and the smoke from his furnace curled upwards, meeting the clouds. Were mothers and their sons walking by telling their boys about how their fathers worked in the building trade and needed the nails? How the nailer had no competition, therefore had a grand house up on the hill near the Lutheran church? Did the sons grow up wanting to be a nailer and have grand houses? Was one of those boys the great-great-granddad to his own father, whom he'd never met? What did his father do now? Was he a builder, a sales clerk, or a doctor? His mother told Andrew little about him. Aunt Molly, well, she had told him all he knew, now. Don't you dare tell your mom I've told you about him. She'd have a fit. You still want to know? Yes, Auntie, please. He was about 6, or maybe he'd been 5. Well, his name is William, but your mom called him Will. She didn't know when she met him that he was married, but he turned out to be the husband of a very wealthy woman on Jersey. Her parents were very, very rich, and they all lived in a palace of a house. Of course, Will told your mom he was miserable. No one in his wife's family respected him and expected that he continue the family business, which had him on the road 5 days a week. He'd once loved his wife a lot, but she wouldn't have children because it would ruin her figure. She was evidently very vain. I don't like the correlation there. Your mom was far prettier 10 years ago than she is now, and Will fell deeply and quickly in love with her. I believe that. Your mom was cautious only then because she knew he traveled a lot and she wanted someone closer. He did what he could to stay close to Belper for almost a month, but then his wife's family got suspicious and he disappeared. He wrote to me once. I was married to your Uncle Philip then. He asked me to tell Bernadette that he would never forget her, that she'd made him happier than he'd ever known, but he was married. He explained his entire situation to me, but I thought it best that it all remain a mystery. I told your mom I thought he was probably married and a cad, and to leave it at that. A month later, she realized that you were on your way. She was extremely hurt by Will abandoning her. When your Uncle Philip died suddenly and left me with huge debts, your mom and I found we needed each other too much to dwell on any one betrayal or loss. We agreed that you would be the one thing that made up for it all. And you have. One day when you're all grown up, we'll see if we can find your father. Andrew thought about that every time his mother beat him. Oh my God, what a sentence. And it was with his father that she was truly angry. But he could never say that. That would betray his auntie's confidence, and that confidence had given him all there was of his father. It was too precious to let go. This boy is so sad. Oh my God. I want to protect him. Oh, the poor thing. God. The next day, it rained. The class stayed inside instead of going out to the playground. Frank did not attempt to talk to Andrew, nor did he acknowledge Andrew when he tried to speak with him. One of the girls who fancied Andrew, thrilled by the fact that there was no one to take Andrew away, flirted with him, completely embarrassing him. Andrew's fleeting attempts at attracting attention, praying someone would save him, went unseen. When she told him she'd like to be his girlfriend, he mumbled something about his mother not allowing him to have girlfriends and bolted. At the bottom of Green Street, he saw the tall, thin figure of a man, his face covered by an umbrella, standing across from his home. Andrew knew it was the old man even before he turned to look at him. He continued to walk up the street, then stopped a few feet away, suddenly taken by a thought. Perhaps this was his granddad. He had found out that his son had sired a child and was looking for Andrew everywhere. Maybe the boy with him had been his brother. What if his father had fled his unhappy marriage and moved to Turkey? And that was why the old man was friendly with Frank, to find out if he was the lost child he'd been looking for. Why hadn't he thought of this before? Oh, God. Oh, no. The old man stepped close to Andrew. Do you live around here? Yes. There, Andrew pointed across the way. You asked me that before, but then I didn't know it was you. You know who I am, then? The stranger smiled, pleased. My father's father? Andrew's heart was beating so fast, soaring with desperate hope. Yes! The old man put his hand over his mouth. My grandson, it is you. Granddad? Yes, it is I. What do they call you? He looked away a moment, which to Andrew felt like an eternity. Andy, isn't it? Yes, Granddad. Andy. I've come to take you home. The old man's face held such warmth and benevolence. Andrew was about to burst with joy. To my father? He nodded. To your father. He will be so pleased to see you. The whole family will. I have a whole family? Oh, Granddad. Really? Yes. I'll tell you all about them. But the aeroplane leaves from Heathrow tomorrow. We will have to leave now if we are going to make it. I have a hotel room near Paddington. But, Mom, Aunt Molly, the lights were on in the kitchen, and he knew his auntie was busy with supper. They've had you for 10 years. It's time your father gets to know you, yes? The flicker of fear, the moment of hesitation melted into decision. He would go where a real family awaited him, the unknown, for which his mom and auntie had long prepared him to meet with trepidation and reluctance, was suddenly a welcome place. Yes, all right, but my clothes? I've got my school blazer and... There is a suitcase full of clothes for you in the hotel. Have you ever been to London before? Granddad, I've never even been in a taxi. Then a taxi we shall take to Derby. Then a first-class coach on the train just for you. I'll need a passport. Won't I need papers or something? On television when they... Yes, yes, my son. You'll have all of that. I have taken care of everything. The old man squeezed Andrew's shoulder, grinning down at Andrew. Everything. Andrew grinned back. Is my family rich then, Granddad? We are an old and wealthy family, my son. Yes, Auntie told me. You don't mind if she told me, do you? She's kept the secret from Mum all these years. Of course not. When you write to your mother and aunt, once you are settled, it will no longer be a secret. You can relax and be free. Suddenly, Andrew realized that it was no longer raining, and a taxi waited at the bottom of the street. It was dark, the streets glistened, and his life was ahead of him, and he was going to his father's home. I don't want to know where their story is going. Can we just pretend there's no ending? Oh my God. Of course, there was no father waiting, though there was a rich family on a huge estate in Turkey. Granddad told Andrew once he was on the aeroplane, strapped into a seat in first class, 33,000 feet up in the air, that he would one day help him find his father. For now, though, there was an ancient and revered family waiting just for him in a home far grander than anything he could imagine, where he would never feel lonely again. Andrew realized then, too late, that the words his mom and auntie had bantered about that evening 2 days ago, kidnapped and pedophile, were now related to him. He told Granddad this, but the old man denied it. Andrew had been chosen. He was special. No one would ever touch him in that way. He was a sacred vessel. Everything the old man said was full of vagaries and obfuscations. Andrew couldn't get a straight answer. The long limousine ride lulled Andrew into a series of naps, each time waking him into the nightmare. They finally slowed as they came to a towering wall of pale bricks covered with climbing vines. Two men without shirts on and fabric wrapped around their heads pulled on the iron gate in the wall until it was open wide enough for the limousine. When Andrew saw the great mansion, he still hoped that his father really was inside and that Granddad had just been playing around with him. Within were many other boys and girls, some near his age, some younger and older. They spoke many languages and dressed in white from neck to toes. They wandered about freely, but they all seemed sad, like the boy who died on the triangle, their eyes empty. Granddad sat on the chair beside the large bed that would be Andrew's. Andrew changed into a white shirt and trousers and white sandals. Granddad watched, but was not curious. His stare was benign, disinterested. Andrew shivered, though the room was warm. Why did you choose me? You had Frank Delaney. Yes, the boy who came to me. Frank was his name? Granddad looked out the window to the bleak, rust and gray sunset, musing. Frank. A hard boy, old in his soul. He lacked the most important attribute, the essence for which we travel the world, the pure emanation. It was you all the while, Andrew. The moment I saw you, I knew. Andrew felt emboldened by pride in having been chosen. No one had really noticed Andrew before, at least not to pick him out from all the others. And never before Frank Delaney. Perhaps this gave him the power. He could survive this. What happened to him? The boys you were with. Did you kill him? Oh, the boy you were with. Did you kill him? And Granddad laughed dryly. Oh no, why would I have done that? He was a great loss. The old man got up and went to the window. No, I didn't kill him, but I was at fault in a way. I was to bring him here in full essence, but I was too hungry. I took from him and could not stop myself. He was exhausted from my feeding, not watching where he was going. I was deeply upset by his passing. My tears were real. Once he was gone, there was nothing for me to do but wait for you. Do you even know if I have a father somewhere? Andrew was scared, angry, and hopeful all at once. Oh yes, I'd know if you had lost him. Boys like you, growing up with overprotective single mothers, absent fathers, sometimes grow into angry, hard young men, just as Frank will, though his father is in the house. Then it is too late. These boys meet the old man, as they inevitably call him, and hate him. Not you, young Andrew. You have kept the hope, a rich part of the essence. You will be prized. The granddad walked to him and placed his hands on his shoulders. But you must retain your essence until you meet the mistress, so I will leave you. I've said too much already. I don't understand any of this. Don't go, please. I don't want to be alone in here. He began to cry. I don't dare stay, young Andrew. I'd be too tempted. You are my penance, my fine to make up for the losses I was so foolishly unable to protect from myself. The old man saw the fear in Andrew, his confusion. You are not a prisoner, son. Look around. Meet some of the others. He went to the door. Are you hungry? Andrew nodded, though he was more afraid than hungry. His stomach was a tight fist in his belly. There is more food than you can dream of downstairs. Go find the dining room. Make friends. See all the toys and books and games available around the grounds. One day soon you will wonder why you ever thought to leave. He waited a moment. You are thinking you'd like to leave, aren't you? Again, Andrew nodded. There was no other thoughts in his head. Oh my God. And you're thinking of your mother, your aunt. What will become of them without you? Andrew looked away, his eyes aching, his face wet with tears. Soon you will not care. Find comfort in the knowledge that you will have no cares, and that you will be treasured far more than you ever were in that dingy mill town of yours. Granddad left. Andrew found himself at the balcony with dry heaves, no food in his gut. He cried, wept until he ached all over. Then he crawled onto the bed and stared up at the canopy of gilded silk. He longed for the smells of home, the wet stone, moss, the musty cellar, a crackling fire of hickory and oak, and Aunt Molly's scones. Here the dry air smelled of dust and peat, cinnamon and sage. It was dark when the door opened and an old woman entered. She went to the bedside and sat down, stroking Andrew's hair. In the darkness, he whispered, Mom? I will be your mother, your father, your God, my son. Fuck, that's a sentence. Your God, my son. and you will be my greatest joy. Lie still, remember all that has been your life, and feel the joy and pleasure that innocence brings. I will not cause you pain or touch you. In turn, your fear will pass, your cares and longings will lessen. Andrew tried to sit up. Her hand went softly to his chest. No, Andrew, trust me. This will be like a dream. Lie still. He obeyed. The woman had a quality even more compelling than the granddad. Her eyes shone in the dark, the same pale blue, her pupils sharp pinpoints floating in the center. She smelled of cedar wood and orange blossoms, though it was more like distant smoke from a smoldering fire than emanating from her. She put her hands over him, as if warming them on the heat that rose from him. He closed his eyes, and the dream came. Nightmares, really. First, he saw his mother, young and naive, silly and carefree. She went to the pub to drink ale with her girlfriends, until a tall, handsome man came in and broke up the girls. He cornered Bernadette and filled her full of flattery. She kissed the man she hardly knew and let him paw her right there in the pub. And then there's some erotic things I'm not reading. After he was done with her, he told her he loved her. She didn't believe him. She didn't dare. They kissed passionately. He promised he would call on her, and then he dropped her at her parents' flat. The next night, she found another man, and the next night another. None of them ever called for her, and none of them was around when she found herself pregnant. So she began sleeping with her sister's husband, Philip, who had always fancied her more than the plain Molly. She claimed Philip was the father. He killed himself rather than face the shame, and Molly. Poor Molly. Philip had mortgaged the house to the limit, had gambling debts and expense accounts for presents to the lovely young Bernadette that were begging payment. Molly lost the house, destitute, on the dole, but when her sister came crawling for help with the brat, Molly swallowed her pride and went to live with Bernadette in their parents' house. In the end, Molly thought, the baby boy could not have been Philip's. The timing was off by almost 3 months. Philip had just been another one of Bernadette's fools. Then there was poor Aunt Molly, stealing from the people she cleaned house for, taking a ring here, a watch there, nothing they could prove Molly had taken, things they could have easily misplaced. In the dream, Andrew saw her standing at her wardrobe, a box of booty in her arms, thinking of the life she'd have when she hawked it all and bought herself a flat of her own. Her antipathies. Yeah. For her bitter sister were evident in her wish that all... Oh, God, I screwed up that sentence so bad. Antipathies. Her antipathies for her bitter sister were evident in her wish that all that was Bernadette's turn to dross. That Andrew was more her child than Bernadette's, and one day she would tell Andrew the truth. That his mother was a whore, not a secretary at Babington Hospital. She laughed then, deeply, loudly, without remorse. The nightmare ended. The woman swooned, sated as he awoke. He looked up to her. She had an aura of light around her that twinkled and pulsed. She sat down on the chair beside the bed and wept. Andrew sat up. In his mind, he thought to go to her, comfort her. She sobbed on, but he could not seem to muster the concern to move. He watched her until she went quiet. What happened to you? Why do I feel like this? She seemed to wake from a reverie and then fixed him with her bright eyes. He did not tell you? The granddad? No. He just talked about essence and treasures. Was it me made you cry? The old woman rose up, took a few steps away. She thought a moment about what she might say, then said nothing. She opened the door. Please, Andrew said flatly. Oh, what's the harm? She returned to the bed. You will know as soon as you talk with the other children. She sat down, leaned against the bedpost. My son, do you see some of the uglier truths of your life now? Do you feel the sorrow in that truth? She waited, but Andrew remained impassive, silent. I have lifted the veil of ignorance you have relied on all... I have lifted the veil of ignorance you have relied on all of your 10 years. Do you not feel different for the weight of your innocence now gone into me? Andrew looked within. It was as dark and wet as the night the granddad had taken him, but there was no glistening. You are unlucky in that you are mine. I will always weep at your loss and the sweetness of my fullness. It confuses. In time, you will no longer be confused. You will just be. She laughed dryly, as the granddad had. And to think that some of the silly human race rather reveres that state, being. They call it enlightenment and spend a lifetime seeking to attain it. She rose again, chuckling, went to the door, and smiled a smile like dice without dots. Until tomorrow. When the door shut behind her, Andrew looked at his hands, felt his face. They were the same as always. He had not changed, really. Tomorrow he would look and see if they had a library without any books on Turkey. With any books on Turkey. He hadn't finished the one he'd left behind somewhere. Well, that was dark and sad. And is called Turkish Delight by Roberta Lannes, Lannes. Lannes, I don't know. What a sad story, but I have to pause to go to the bathroom. I have drank too much. I will be right back, I promise. I don't really pause that often. Should I have some kind of like queued up spooky music to play in the bathroom or in the background while I'm in the bathroom? Shark music or something. Dun-dun-dun-dun. Okay, I'm probably gonna stop with this third story. And the third story is called Venus Rising on Water by Tanith Lee. So far, I've written 7 novels about vampires, reveals the author, or types of vampire, and quite a lot of short stories of various lengths. Vampirism, to me, is one of those themes where somehow another idea or twist is always making itself known to me. The subject seems limitless, perhaps because the vampire seems somehow to have woven itself among the human psyche. Venus Rising on Water came initially from a fascination with Venice, which may be seen in futurist, distorted form in the venue. Ironically, the name Venus has since become my name for Venice in the cycle of books I'm currently writing for Overlook in America, of which only the last may at all be classed as science fiction, but this story is science fiction. It's about the clash between the future and the past, although the denouement, however odd or apparently fortuitous, demonstrates the hold everyday real life can get on the strangest matters. Cue up another bathroom break. Like long hair, the weeds grew down the facades of the city, over ornate shutters and leaden doors into the pale green silk of the lagoon. 1,000 ancient mansions crumbled. Sometimes a flight of birds was exhaled from their crowded mass, or a thread of smoke was drawn up into the sky. Day long, a mist bloomed on the water, out of which distant towers rose like snakes of deadly gold. Once in every month a boat passed, carving the lagoon that had seemed thickened beyond movement. Far less often, here and there, a shutter cracked open and the weed hair broke. A stream of plaster fell like a blue ray. Then some faint face peered out, probably eclipsed by a mask. It was a place of veils. Visitors were occasional. They examined the decaying mosaics. I always, it's one of those words that, like, I always wanted to call lingerie, like, I don't know, something that is insane. Loitered in the caves of arches, hunted phantoms through the marble tunnels. And under the streets, they took photographs. One bald flash scouring a century off the catacombs and sewers. The lacework coffins, the handful of albino rats perched up on them, caught in a second like ghosts of white hearts, mute with waiting eyes. I can already tell I'm gonna have a lot of stuttering in this story. It's one of those where, like, the sentences don't go anywhere my brain is anticipating. The dawn star shone in the lagoon on a tail of jagged silver. The sun rose. There was an unsuitable noise. The boat was coming. There, said the girl on the deck of the boat. Stop there, please. The boat sidled to a pavement and stood out on... Oh, my God. The boat sidled to a pavement and stood on the water, trembling and murmuring. The girl left it with a clumsy gracefulness and poised at the edge of the city with her single bag, cheerful and undaunted before the lonely cliffs of masonry and all times indifference. She was small, about 25, with ornately short fair hair, clad in old-fashioned jeans and a shirt. Her skin was fresh, her eyes bright with intelligent foolishness. She looked about and upward, her interest clearly centered on a particular house, which overhung the water like a face above a mirror, its eyes closed. Presently, the boat pulled away and went off across the lagoon, and only the girl and the silence remained. She picked up her bag and walked along the pavement to an archway with a shut leaden door. Here she knocked boldly, as if too stupid to understand the new silence must not yet be tampered with. Her knocking sent hard blobs of sound careering. Maybe that's a typo. Maybe it's not. Round the vault of greenish crystal space that was the city's morning. They seemed to strike peeling walls and stone pilasters 5 miles off. From the house itself came no response, not even the vague sense of something stirring like a serpent in sleep. Now this is too bad, said the girl to the silence, upbraiding it mildly. They told me a caretaker would be here in time for the boat. She left her bag, subconscious acknowledgement of the emptiness and indifference, by the gate, and walked along under the leaning face of the house. From here she saw the floors of the balconies of flowered iron. She listened for a sudden snap of shutters, but only the water lapped under the pavement, component of silence. This house was called the Palace of the Planet. The girl knew all about it, and what she did not know she had come here to discover. She was writing a long essay that was necessary to her career of scholastic journalism. She was not afraid. In the facade of the Palace of the Planet was another door, plated with green bronze. The weed had not choked it, and over its top leaned a marble woman with bare breasts and a dove in her hands. The girl reached out and rapped with a bronze knocker shaped like a fist. Oh, that's cool. A knocker shaped like a fist. The house gave off a sound that after all succeeded in astonishing her. It must be a hollow shell, unfurnished, half its walls fallen. These old cities were museums now, kept for their history, made available on request to anyone. Not many who wished to view. They had their dwellers also, but in scarcity. Destitutes and eccentrics lived in them, monitored by the state. The girl, whose name was Jonquil Hare, had seen the register of this place. In all, there was 174 names, some queried, where once had teemed thousands, crushing each other in the ambition to survive. The hollow howling of her knock faded in the house. That was a fun sentence. The hollow howling of her knock faded in the house. Sorry, I'm probably talking too much. Jonquil said, "I'm coming in." "I am," and marched back to her bag beneath the leaden gate. She surveyed the gate and the knotted weed which had come down on it. Jonquil Hare tried the weed. It resisted her strongly. She took up her bag, in which there was nothing breakable, seasoned traveler as she was, and flung it over the arch. She took the weed in her small, strong hands and hauled herself up in her clumsy, graceful way up to the arch and sat there, looking in at a morning twilight garden of shrubs that had not been pruned in 100 years, and trees that became each other. A blue fountain shone dimly. Jonquil smiled upon it and swung herself over in the weed and slithered down into the environ of the house. All right. By midday, Jonquil had gone busily over most of the palace of the planet. Its geography was fixed in her head, but partly, confusedly, for she liked the effect of a puzzle of rooms and corridors. Within the lower portion of the house, a large hall gave on to a large enclosed inner courtyard. That, in turn, had led to the garden. Above, chambers of the first story would have opened on to the court, but their doors were sealed by the blue-green weed, which had smothered the court itself, and so turned it into a strange undersea grotto where columns protruded like yellow coral. Above the lower floor, 2 long staircases drew up into apparently uncountable annexes and cells, into a great salon with tarnished mirrors also broken like spiderweb. The salon had tall windows that stared through their blind shutters at the lagoon. There were carvings everywhere, lacking light. She did not study them now, and, as suspected, there was very little furniture. A pair of desks with hollow drawers, spindly chairs, a divan in rotted ivory silk. In one oblong room was a bed frame with vast tapering pillars like idle rockets. Cobwebby draperies shimmered from the canopy in a draught, while patches of bled emerald sunlight hovered on the floor. Jonquil succeeded in opening a shutter in the salon. A block of afternoon fell in. Next door, in the adjacent chamber, she set up her inflatable mattress, her battery lamp and heater, some candles she had brought illegally in a padded tube. Sitting on her unrolled mat in a subaqueous light of a shattered window which refused to give, she ate from her pack of food snacks and drank cola. Then she arranged some books and notepads, pens and pencils, a magnifier, camera in unit, and a miniature recorder on the unfolded table. She spoke to the room, as from the start she had spoken consecutively to the house. Well, here we are. But she was restless. The caretaker must be due to arrive, and until this necessary procedure had taken place, interruption hung over her. Of course, the caretaker would enable Jonquil to gain possession of the house secrets. The holostatic displays of furnishings, an earlier life that might have been indigenous. Not even close, indigenous. All right, do that sentence over, you mess. Of course, the caretaker would enable Jonquil to gain possession of the house secrets, the holostatic displays of furnishings in earlier life that might have been indigenous here, the hidden walks and rooms that undoubtedly lay inside the walls. Jonquil was tired. She had risen at 3 a.m. for the boat after an evening of hospitable farewells. She lay down on her inflatable bed with the pillow under her neck. Through half-closed eyes, she saw the room breathing with pastel motes of sun and heard the rustle of weed at the shutter. She dreamed of climbing a staircase which, dreaming, seemed new to her. At the foot of the stair, a marble pillar supported a globe of some aquamarine material, covered by small configurations of alien land masses, isolate in seas? The globe was a whimsical and inaccurate 18th century rendition of the planet Venus, to which the house was mysteriously affiliated. As she climbed the stairs, random sprinklings of light came and went. Jonquil sensed that someone was ascending with her, step for step, not on the actual stair, but inside the peeling wall at her left side. Near the top of the stair, which was lost in darkness, an arched window had been let into the wall, milky and unclear, and further obscured by some drops of waxen-stained glass. As she came level with the window, Jonquil glanced sidelong at it. A shadowy figure appeared on the far side of the pane, perhaps a woman, but hardly to be seen. Jonquil started awake at the sound of the caretaker's serviceable shoes clumping into the house. The caretaker was a woman. She did not offer her name and no explanation for her late arrival. She had brought the house manual and advised Jonquil on how to operate the triggers in its panel. Visions flickered annoyingly over the rooms and were gone. A large box contained facsimiles of things pertaining to the house and its history. Jonquil had seen most of these already. There are the upper rooms, the attics. Here's the master key. The woman showed Jonquil a hidden stair that probed these upper reaches of the house. It was not the stairway from the dream, but narrow and winding as the steps of a bell tower. There were no other concealed chambers. If there's anything else you find you require, you must go out to the booth in the square. Here is the code to give the machine. And I need some water. Oh no, I'm out. Gonna switch straws. No, I can't switch straws. Great. Okay. Where the fuck was I? I'm a mess tonight. The caretaker was middle-aged, stout, and uncharming. She seemed not to know the house at all, only everything about it. What? How does she not know the house at all, but everything about it? And glanced around her disapprovingly. Doubtless she lived in one of the contemporary golden towers across the lagoon, which, in the lingering powder of mist, passed for something older and more strange than they were not. Who came here last? Asked Jonquil. Did anyone? There was a visitor in the spring of the last centenary year. He stayed only one day to study the plaster, I believe. Jonquil smiled, pleased and smug, that the house was virtually all her own, for the city's last centenary had been 20 years ago, nearly her lifetime. She was glad when the caretaker left, and the silence of the house did not occur to Jonquil as she went murmuring about from room to room, able now to operate the shutters, bring in light, and examine the carvings in corners on cornices. Most of them showed earlier defacement as expected. She switched on to scenes from the manual of costumed dining and conversing figures amid huge pieces of furniture and swags of brocade. No idea of ghosts were suggested by those hollow stets. Jonquil reserved a candlelit masked ball for a later, more fitting hour. The greenish amber of afternoon slid into the plate of water. A chemical rose flooded the sky like color processing for a photograph. Venus, the evening star, was visible beyond the garden. Jonquil climbed up the bell tower steps to the attics. The key turned easily in an upper door. But the attics disappointed. They were high and dark. Her flashlight penetrated like a sword, webbed with the woven dust and thick with damp, and a sour cloacal smell that turned the stomach of the mind. Otherwise, there was an almost emptiness. From beams hung unidentified shreds. On one wall, a tapestry on a frame, indecipherable, presumably not thought good enough for renovation. Jonquil moved reluctantly through the obscured space, telling it was in a poor state, commiserating with it, until she came against a chest of cold black wood. Now what are you? Jonquil inquired of the chest. Can you guys hear my cats eating? They have a little ball that they roll for treats. And of course they can roll it forever. Now what are you? Jonquil inquired of the chest. It was long and low, its lid carved over with a design that had begun to crumble. Curious fruits in a wreath. The shape of the chest reminded her of something. She peered at the fruits. Were they elongate lemons? Pomegranates? Perhaps they were meant to be Venusian fruits. The astrologer Johannes, who had lived in the palace of the planet, had played over the house his obsession and ignorance with and of Venus. He had claimed in his treatise closely to have studied the surface of the planet through his own telescope. There was an atmosphere of clouds parting slowly beneath an underlake landscape, cratered and mountained upon limitless waters. The mirror of Venus is her sea, Johannes wrote, and he had painted her, but his daubs were lost, like most of his writing, reputedly burned. He had haunted the house alive, an old wild man, watching for star rise, muttering. He had died in the charity hospital, penniless and mad. His servants had destroyed his work, frightened of it, and vandalized the decorations of the house. Jonquil tried to raise the lid of the chest. It would not come up. Are you locked? But there was no lock. The lid was stuck, or merely awkward. "I shall come back," said Jonquil. She had herself concocted an essay on the astrologer, but rather as a good little girl writes once a year to her senile grandfather. She appreciated his involvement, but for him none of this would be, but he did not interest her. It was the house that did it. It was the house which did that. There was a switch on the manual that would conjure acted reconstructions of the astrologer's life, even to the final days, and to the rampage of the Vandals. But Jonquil did not bother with this record. It was to her as if the house had adorned itself, using the man only as an instrument. His paintings and notes were subsidiary, and she had not troubled much over their disappearance. "Yes, I'll be back with a wrench, and you'd just better have something in there worth looking at," said Jonquil to the chest. Doubtless it was vacant. Night on the lagoon in the city. The towers in the distance offered no lights being constructed to conceal them. In two far-off spots, a pale glow crept from the window to the water. The silence of night was not like the silence of day. Jonquil sang as the travel cook prepared her steak, and, drinking a glass of reconstituted I can't say the word wine. Going out into the salon, she switched on the masked ball. At once the room was over 200 years younger. It was drenched in gilt, and candle flames stood like flowers of golden diamond on their stems of wax, while the ceiling revealed dolphins and doves who escorted a goddess over a sea in a ship that was a shell. The windows were open to a revised night hung with diamante lamps, to a lagoon of black ink where bright boats were passing to the sound of mandolins. The salon purred and thrummed with voices. It was impossible to decipher a word, yet laughter broke through in clear notes of the music. No one danced as yet. Perhaps they never would, for they were creatures from another world indeed. Everyone clad in gold and silver, ebony and glacial white, the jewels on them like water drops tossed up by a wave. They had no faces. Their heads were those of plumed herons and horned deer, black velvet cats and lions of the sun and moon lynxes, angels, demons, mere things from out of the lagoon, and scarabs from the hollows of time. They moved and promenaded, paused with teardrops of glass holding blood-like wine, fluttered their fans of peacocks and palm leaves. Jonquil stayed at the edge of the salon. She could have walked straight through them, through their holostatic actors' bodies and their prop garments of silk, steel, and chrysoprase, but she preferred to stay in the doorway, drinking her own wine, adapting her little song to the tune of the mandolins. After the astrologer had gone, others had come and passed in the house. The rich lady and the prince, with their masks and balls, suppers and recitals. The travel cook chimed, and Jonquil switched off 200 elegantly acting persons, 1,000 faked gems and lights, and went to eat her steak. She wrote with her free hand, "Much too pretty. Tomorrow I must photograph the proper carvings," and said this over aloud. Jonquil dreamed she was in the attic. There was a vague light, perhaps the moon coming in at cracks in the shutters, or the dying walls. Below, a noise went on, the holostatic masked ball which she had forgotten to switch off. Jonquil looked at the chest of black wood. She had realized she did not have to open it herself. Downstairs, in the salon, an ormolu clock struck midnight, the hour of unmasking. There was a little click. In the revealing darkness, the lid of the chest began to lift. Jonquil knew what it had reminded her of. A shadow sat upright in the coffin of the chest. It had a slender but indefinite form, and yet it turned its head, and Jonquil saw the two eyes looking at her, only the eyeballs gleaming in two crescents in the dark. The lid fell over with a crash. Jonquil woke up, sitting on her inflatable bed with her hands at her throat, her eyes raised toward the ceiling. "A dream," announced Jonquil. She turned on her battery lamp, and the small room appeared. There was no sound in the house. Beyond the closed door, the salon rested. "Silly," said Jonquil. She lay and read a book having nothing to do with the palace of the planet until she fell asleep with the light on. The square was a terrifying ruin. Hidden by the frontage of the city, it was nearly inconceivable. Upper stories had collapsed onto the paving. Only the skeletons of architecture remained, with occasionally a statue, some of them shining green and vegetable, the dissolution of gold piercing through. The pavings was broken up, marked by the slough of birds. Here the booth arose, unable to decay. There's a chest in the attics. It won't open, John Quill accused the receiver. The manual lists it. It says, 1 sablewood jester chest. The reply came, this is why you are unable to open it. A jester chest was just that, a deceiving or joke object, often solid. There is nothing inside. No, said John Quill, some jester chests do open, and this isn't solid. I am afraid you are wrong. The chest has been investigated and contains nothing. Neither is there any means to open it. An X-ray doesn't always show, began John Quill, but the machine had disconnected. I won't have this, said John Quill. It's always someone who thinks they know better than everyone else that starts all the bullshit. 3 birds blew over the square. Beneath, in the sewers, the colony of voiceless rats, white as moonlight, ran noiselessly under her feet. But she would not shudder. John Quill shuddered. Okay, we're gonna. Ugh. But she would not shudder. John Quill strutted back to the house through alleys of black rot where the windows were suspended like lingering cards of ice. Smashed glass lay underfoot. The awful smell of the sea was in the alleys, for the sea came in and in. It had drowned the city in psychic reality, and already lay far over the heads of all the buildings, calm, oily and still, reflecting the sun and the stars. John Quill got into the house by the gate door the manual had made accessible. Crossing the garden where the blue fountain was a girl crowned with myrtle. John Quill went straight up over the doors to the attic stair and climbed that. The attic door was ajar as she believed she had left it. Here I am, said John Quill. The morning light was much stronger in the attics, and she did not need her torch. She found the chest and bent over it. You've got a secret. Maybe you're only warped shut. That would be the damp up here. There may be a lining that could baffle the X-ray. She tried the wrench, specifically designed not to inflict any injury, but it slipped and slithered and did no good. John Quill knelt down and began to feel all over the chest, searching for some spring or other mechanism. She was caressing the chest, going so cautiously and delicately over it. Its likeness to a coffin was very evident, but bones would have been seen. Giving me dreams, she said. Something moved against her finger. It was very slight. It was as if the chest had wriggled under her, tickling and testing like a sleeping child. Okay. John Quill put back her hand. She had flinched and reprimanded herself. At her touch, the movement came again. She heard the clarity of the click she had heard before in the dream, and before she could stop herself, she jumped up and stepped backwards. 1, 2, 3, until the wall stopped her. The lid of the chest was coming up, gliding over and slipping down without any noise, but a mild slap. Nothing sat up in the chest, but John Quill saw the edge of something lying there in it, in the shadow of it. Yes, it is, she said, and went forward. She leaned on the chest familiarly now. Familiarly. Everything was explained, even the psychokinetic activity of the dream. A painting. John Quill Hare leaned on the chest and stared in. Presently, she took hold of the elaborate and gilded frame and got the picture angled upward a short way, so it too leaned on the chest. The painting was probably 3 centuries old. She could tell that from the pigments and disposition of the oils, but not from the artist. The artist was unknown. In size, it was an upright oblong about 15 meters by 1 meter in width. I don't understand why the artist would be unknown. Everybody signs their work. Maybe flip it over? The work was a full-length portrait, rather well executed and proportioned, lacking only any vestige of life or animation. It might have been the masterly likeness of a handsome doll. This was how the artist had given away his amateur status. She looked like a woman of about John Quill's age, which, given the period, meant, of course, that she would have been far younger, 18 or 19 years. You're only like 24? 18 or 19 is not far younger. Calm down. Her skin was pale and had a curious tint, as did in fact the entire scene, perhaps due to some corrosion of the paint, but even so it had not gone to the usual brown and mud tones, but rather to a sort of yellowish blue. Therefore the color scheme of clothing and hair might be misleading, for the long loose tresses were yellowish blonde and the dress bluish gray. Like the hair, the dress was loose, a robe of a kind, and yet, naturally, both hair and robe were draped in a particular manner that dated them, as surely as if their owner had been gowned and coiffured at the apex of that day's fashion. Coiffured? Yeah, that makes more sense. She was slender but looked strong. There was no plumpness to her chin and throat. Her hands were narrow, an unusually masculine woman, more suitable to Jonquil's century, where the sexes often blended, slim and lightly muscular. The woman in the painting was also like this. Her face was impervious, its eyes black. She was not beautiful or alluring. It was a flat animal face, tempered like the moon by its own chill light, and lacking sight or true expression because the artist had not understood how to intercept them. Behind the woman was a vista that Jonquil took at first for the lagoon, but then she saw that between the fog blank of blued yellow cloud and the bluish-greenish water, a range of pocked and fissured mountains lurched like an unearthly aqueduct. It was the landscape of Johannes's Venus. The artist of the picture was the mad astrologer who had invested the house. How could it be that the authorities had missed this find? My, said Jonquil to the painting. She was excited. What would this not be worth in tokens of fame? She pulled on the painting again, more carefully than before. It was light for its size. She could manage it. She paused a moment, close to the woman on the canvas. The canvas was strange, the texture of it under the paint, but in those days, 3 centuries before, they had sometimes used odd materials. Even some chemical or experimental potion could have been mixed with the paint to give it now its uncanny tinge. A name was written in a scroll at the bottom of the picture. Well, there you go. Jesus, just look for the name. Jonquil took it for a signature, but it was not the astrologer's name, though near enough it indicated some link. Jonina, said Jonquil. We are going for a short walk down to where I can take a proper look at you. With enormous care now, she drew the picture of Jonina out of the attics and down to the narrow stair towards the salon. Jonquil was at the masked ball. In her hand was a fan of long white feathers caught in the claw of zircons. Her costume was of white satin streaked with silver veins, and her face was masked like a white furred cat. I mean, that's a look. Doja Cat? She knew her hair was too short for the day and age, and this worried her by its inappropriateness. No one spoke to her, but all around they chattered to each other, incomprehensibly, and their curled, powdered hair poured out of their masks like milk boiling over. Jonquil observed everything acutely. The man daintily taking snuff, an addict. The woman in the dress striped black and ivory peering through her ruby eyeglass. Out on the lagoon, the gleaming boats went by, trailing red roses in the water. Jonquil was aware that no one took any notice of her, had anything to do with her, and she was peevish, because they must have invited her. Who was she supposed to be? A duke's daughter or his mistress? Should she not be married at her age and have borne children? She would have to pretend. There was a man with rings on every finger, and beyond him a checkered mandolin player, and beyond him a woman stood in a gray gown different from the rest. Her mask covered all her face. It was the countenance of a globe, perhaps the moon, in silver, and about hair like pale tarnished fleece. Too long, as Jonquil's was too short, was falling to her pelvis over the bodice of the gown. A group of actors, yes, they were only acting, it was not real, intervened. The woman was hidden for a moment, and when the group had passed, she was gone. She was an actress, too, which was why Jonquil had thought something about her recognizable. Jonquil became annoyed that she should be here, among actors, for acting was nothing to do with her. She turned briskly and went towards the door of the chamber that led off from the salon. Inside, the area was dark, yet everything there was visible, and Jonquil was surprised to see a huge bed frame from another room dominating the space. Surely Jonquil's professional impedimenta had been put there, and the inflatable sleeping couch she traveled with? As for this bed, she had seen it elsewhere, and it had been naked then, but now it was dressed. Silk curtains hung from the pillars, and a mattress, pillows, sheets, and embroidered coverlet were on it. Rather than the pristine appearance of a model furnishing, the bed had a slightly rumpled, tumbled look, as if Jonquil had indeed used it. Jonquil closed the door of the room firmly on the ball outside, and all sound of it at once ceased. To her relief, she found that she was actually undressed, and in the thin shirt that was her night garment. She went to the bed resigned and got into it. She lay back on the pillows. The bed was wonderfully comfortable, lushly undisciplined. Johannes's house was so silent, noiseless. Jonquil lay and listened to the total absence of sound, which was like a pressure, as if she had floated down beneath the sea. Her bones were coral and pearls her eyes. Fish might swim in through the slats of a shutter, across the water of the air, but before that happened, the door would open again. The door opened. The doorway was lit with moonlight, and the salon beyond it, for the masked ball was gone. Only the woman with the silver planet face remained, and she came over the threshold. Behind her, in lunar twilight, Jonquil saw the lagoon lying across the salon, and the walls had evaporated, leaving a misty shore and mountains that were tunneled through. The bed itself was adrift on water and bobbed gently, but Jonina crossed without difficulty. Her silver mask was incised like the carvings in the house corners, the globes that were the planet Venus. The mask reflected in the water, 2 silver discs separated, drawing nearer. Jonquil said sternly, "I must wake up." And she dived upward from the bed and tore through layers of cloud or water and came out into the actual room, rolling on the inflatable couch. "I'm not frightened," stated Jonquil. "Why should I be?" She turned on her battery lamp and angled the light to fall across the painting of Jonina, which she had leaned against the wall. "What are you trying to tell me now? In the morning, I'm going to call them up about you. Don't you want to be famous?" The painting had no resonance. It looked poorly in the harsh glare of the lamp, a stilted figure in crackpot scenery, the brushwork disordered. The canvas was so smooth. "Go to sleep," said Jonquil to Jonina, and shut off the light as if to be sensible with a tiresome child. In the true dark, which had no moon, the silence of the house crept closer. Dispassionately, Jonquil visualized old Johannes padding about the floors in his broken soft shoes. He thought he had seen the surface of the planet Venus. He had painted the planet as an allegory that was a woman, just like the puns of Venus, the goddess, in marble over the door and on the ceiling of the salon. Jonquil began to see Johannes in his study, among the alchemical muddle, the primeval alchemical chaos from which all perfect creation evolved. But she regarded him offhandedly, the dust and grime and spillages, the blackened skulls and lembics, growing moss. That's probably a misspell. It's probably like limbics. Whatever. Johannes wrote on parchment with a goose quill. He wrote in Latin also, and although she had learned Latin in order to pursue her study, this was too idiosyncratic, too much of its era for her to follow. Then the words began to sound, and she grasped them. Bored, Jonquil attended. She did not recall switching on this hollow stet, could not think why she had decided to play it. So, on the 43rd night, after an hour of watching, the cloud parted, and there was before me the face of the planet. I saw great seas, or one greater sea, with smaller masses of land, pitted like debased silver, and the mountains I saw, and all this in a yellow glow from the cloud. Jonquil wondered why she did not stop the hollow stet. She was not interested in this, but she could not remember where the manual was. For 7 nights I applied myself to my telescope, and on each night the clouds of the planet sensuously parted, allowing me a view of her bareness. The clouds sensually parted. Jonquil thought she would have to leave the bed in order to switch off the manual, but the bed, with its tall draped posts, was warm and comfortable. On the 8th night it came to me. Even as I watched, I was watched in my turn. Some creature was there, some unseen intelligence, which, sensing my appraisal, reached out to seize me. I do not know how such a thing is possible. Where I see only a miniature of that world, it sees me exactly, where and what I am, every atom. At once I removed myself, left my perusal, and shut up the instrument. But I believe I was too late. Somehow it has come to me, here in the world of men. It is with me, although I cannot hear it or behold it. It is the invisible air. It is the silence of the night. What shall I do? The hollow stet of Johannes was no longer operating. Jonquil lay in the 4-poster bed in the room that led from the salon. The door was shut. Someone was in the room with her, beside the bed. Jonquil turned her head on the pillow, without hurry, to see. A hand was stroking back her short hair. It was very pleasant. She was a cat that was being caressed. Jonquil smiled lazily. It was like the first day of the holidays, and her mother was standing by her bed, and they would talk. But no, not her mother. It was the wonderful-looking woman she had seen. Where was that now? Perhaps in the city, an eccentric who lived there, out walking in the turquoise of dusk, or funeral orchid of, dawning, when the star was on the lagoon. Very tall, a developed, lithe body, graceful, with the blue wrap tied loosely, and the amazing hair, so thick and blonde, falling over it, over her shoulders, in the firm cupped line of the breasts, the flat belly, and into the mermaid V of the thighs. "Hello," said Jonquil, and the woman gave the faintest shake of her lion's head and its mane. Jonquil was not to speak. They did not need words. But the woman smiled, too. It was such a sensational smile, so effortless, stimulating, and calming. The dark, dark eyes rested on Jonquil with a tenderness that was also cruel. Jonquil had seen this look in the eyes of others, and a frisson of eagerness went over her, and she was ashamed. It was too soon to expect. But the woman was leaning over her now, the marvel of face blurred, and the mane of hair trickling over Jonquil's skin. The mouth kissed, gently and unhesitatingly. "Oh, yes," said Jonquil, without any words. The woman, who was called Jonina, was lying on her. She was heavy, her weight crushed and pinned, and Jonquil was helpless. It was the most desired thing, to be helpless like this, unable even to lift her own hands, as if she had no strength at all. And then they had sex. And when there was nothing left, she woke up in the pitch-black void of the silence, with something hard and cold, clammy, but nearly weightless, lying on her, an oblong in a gilded frame, the painting which had dropped over on top of her and covered her from breast to ankle. She flung it off, and it clattered down. She clutched at her body, thinking to discover herself clotted with a sort of glue or slime, but there was nothing like that. She was weak and dizzy, and her heart drummed noisily, so she could not hear the silence any more. Toast to that. You're just fucking a painting. "Let me speak to the house caretaker," snapped Jonquil at the obtuse machine. Outside the booth, the ruin of the great square seemed to sway on the wind, which was violent, ruffling the lagoon in flounces, whirling small scraps of colored substances that might have been paper, rags, or skin. "The caretaker is not available. However, your request has been noted. But this picture is an important find, and I want it removed, today, to a place of safety." The machine had disconnected. Jonquil stood in the booth, as if inside a spacesuit, and watched the alien atmosphere of the city swirling with bits and colors. "Don't be a fool," said Jonquil. She left the booth and cowered before the wind, which was not like any breeze felt in civilized places. "It's an old painting, a bad old painting. So you're lonely. You had a dream. Get back to work." Jonquil worked. She photographed all the carvings she had decided were relevant or unusually bizarre. Venus the goddess riding the crescent moon, a serpent coiled about a planet that maybe was simply an orb. She put these into the developer and later drew them out and arranged them in her room beside the salon. She had already moved the painting of Jonina into the salon. She felt tired, and it seemed heavier than before. left it with its face to the wall, propped under the mirrors. It was now about 25 meters from her inflatable bed and well outside the door. She went over the house again, measuring and recording comments. She opened shutters and regarded the once hive-like cliffs of the city and the waters on the other side. The wind settled and a mist condensed. By mid-afternoon, the towers of modernity were quite gone. The light always has a green tinge, blue and yellow mixed. When the sky pinkens at dawn or sunset, the water is bottle green, an apothecary's bottle, and purple for the pros, Jonquil added. In 2 hours it would be dusk, and then night. This was ridiculous. She had to face up to herself that she was nervous and apprehensive, but there was nothing to be afraid of, or even to look forward to. She still felt depressed, exhausted, so she took some more vitamins. Something she had eaten probably before leaving for the city had caught up with her, and that might even account for the dreams. She did not go up into the attics. She spent some time out of doors, in the grotto of the courtyard and in the garden, which the manual showed her with paved paths and carven box hedges, orange trees, and the fountain playing. She did not watch this hall estate long. Her imagination was working too, and too hard, and she might start to see Jonina in a blue-gray gown going about between the trees. What, anyway, was Jonina? Doubtless, Jonquil's unconscious had based the Johannes part of the dream on scraps of the astrologer's writings she had seen, and that she had consciously forgotten. Johannes presumably believed some alien intelligence from the planet he observed had made use of the channel of his awareness. For him it was female. Interesting women, then, were always witches, demons. He would be bound to think in that way. And when she suborned him, in his old man's obsession, he painted her approximately to a woman, just as he had approximated his vision of the planet to something identifiable, the pastoral of a cool hell. And he gave his demoness a name birthed out of his own, a strange daughter. Jonquil did not recollect, try as she would, reading anything so curious about Johannes, but she must have done. He then concealed the painting of his malign innamorata in the trick chest to protect it from the destructive fears of the servants. Only after hour, and the sky would infuse like pale tea and rose petals. Only another hour, and the sky would infuse like pale tea and rose petals. The sun would go, the star would visit the garden, darkness. You're not as tough as you thought, said Jonquil. She disapproved of herself. All right, we'll sit this one out. Stay awake tonight, and tomorrow I'll get a hold of that damn caretaker lady if I have to swim there. As soon as it was sunset, Jonquil went back to her chosen room. She had to pass through the salon and had an urge to go up to the picture, turn it round, and scrutinize it. But that was stupid. She had seen all there was to see. She shut her inner door on the salon with a bang. Now she was separate from all the house. She lit her lamp and, pulling out her candles, lit those too. She primed the travel cook for a special meal, chicken with a lemon sauce, creamed potatoes. And as the wing of night unfolded over the lagoon, she closed the shutter and switched on a music tape. She sat drinking wine and writing up that day's notes on the house. After all, she had done almost all that was needed. Might she not see if she could leave tomorrow? To hire transport before the month was up, and the regular boat arrived, would be expensive, but then she could get to work the quicker, perhaps, away from the house. She had meant to explore the city, of course, but it was in fact less romantic than dejecting, and potentially dangerous. She might run into one of the insane inhabitants, and then what? Jonquil thought, acutely visualizing the nocturnal mass of the city. No one was alive in it, surely. The few lights, the occasional smokes and whispers, were inaugurated by machines to deceive. There were the birds and their subterranean counterparts, the rats. Only she alone, Jonquil Hare, was here this night between masonry and water, she alone and one other. Don't be silly, said Jonquil. How loud her voice sounded. Now the music had come to an end. The silence was gigantic, a fifth dimension. It seemed wrong to put on another tape. The silence should not be angered. Let it lie. Move quietly. Do not speak at all. Johannes wrote quickly, as if he might be interrupted. His goose pen snapped, and he seized another ready cut. He spoke the words aloud as he wrote them, although his lips were closed. For days and for nights, when I could not sleep, I was aware of the presence of my invader. I told myself it was my fancy, but I could not be rid of the sensation of it. I listened for the sounds of breathing. I looked for a shadow. There were none of these. I felt no touch, and when I dozed fitfully in the dark, waking suddenly, no beast crouched on my breast. Yet it was with me. It breathed. It brushed by me. It touched me without hands and watched me with its unseen eyes. So passed 5 days and 4 nights, and on the evening of the 5th day, even as the silver planet stood above the garden, it grew bold, knowing by now it had little to fear from me in my terror, and took on a shape. Yes, it took on a sort of shape, but if this is its reality, I cannot know, or only some semblance, all it can encompass here ordains to assume. It hung across the window, and faintly through it the light of dusk was ebbing. A membranous thing, like a snail. It did not move. No pulse of life seemed in it, and yet it lived. I shut the door on it, but later I returned. In the candle's light, I saw it had fallen, or lowered itself, to my table. It had kept its soft sheen of blue. I touched it. I could not help myself. And it had the texture of vellum, that is, of skin. It lay before me, the length of the table, and under it dimly I could discern the outline of my books, my dish of powders, and other things. I cannot describe my state. My terror had sunk into a sort of blinded wonderment. I do not know how great a while I stood and looked at it, but at length I heard the girl with my food, and I went out and locked up the room again. What would it do while I was gone? Would it perhaps vanish again? That night I slept, stupefied, and in the morning opened my eyes, and there the thing hung above me, inside the canopy of the very bed. How long had it been there, watching me with its invisible organs of sight? Of course, its method had been simple. It had slid under the doors of my house so long dressed for it, and named for its planet in the common vernacular. What now must I do? What is required of me? For clearly I shall become its slave. It seems to me I am supposed to be able to give it a more usual form, some camouflage, so that if may pass with men. But how is that possible? Okay. It seems to me I am supposed to be able to give it a more usual form, some camouflage, so that it may pass with men. But how is that possible? How render such a thing ordinary and attractive? The means came to me in my sleep. Perhaps the being has influenced my brain. There is one sure way. It has noticed my canvases. Now I am to stretch the skin upon a frame and put paint to it. What shall I figure there? No doubt I shall be guided in what I do, as it has led me to the idea. I must obscure my actions from my servants. They are already ill at ease, and the man was very threatening this morning. He is a ruffian, and capable of anything. It will be wise to destroy these papers when all else is done. Jonquil returned from Johannes and saw a group of friends she had not communicated with in 3 years, gliding over the lagoon in a white boat. They waved and shouted, and Jonquil knew she had been rescued. She would escape, but running towards the boat, she heard a metallic crash and jumped inadvertently up out of the dream into the room where her candles were burning low, fluttering, and the air quivered like a disturbed pond. The silence had been agitated after all. There had been some noise, like the noise in the dream which woke her. She sat bolt upright in the lock of fear. She had never felt fear in this way in her life. She had meant to stay awake, but the meal, the wine, and the dream of Johannes, absurd. Outside, in the mirrored night-time salon, there came a sharp, screeching scrape. Jonquil's mind shrieked, and she clamped her hand over her mouth. "Don't be a fool. Listen." She listened. The silence. Had she imagined? The noise came again, harsher and more absolute. It was like the abrasion of a rusty chain dragged along the marbled floor. And again. Jonquil sprang up. In her life, where she had never before known such fear, the credo had been that fear, confronted, proved to be less than it had seemed. Always the maxim held true. It was this brainwashing of accredited experience which sent her to the door of the room and caused her to dash it wide and stare outwards. The guttering gleam of the candles, so opposite to the house, gave a half presence to the salon, but mostly it was black, thick and composite, black, watery, and uncertain on the ruined faces of the mirrors. And out of this blackness came a low flicker of motion, catching the candlelight along its edge. And this motion made the sound she had heard and now heard again. Jonquil did not believe what she saw. She did not believe it. No, this was still the dream, and she must wake up. The picture of Jonina, painted by the astrologer on a piece of membranous, bluish alien skin, had fallen over in its frame, and now the framed skin pulled itself along the floor, and catching the light, Jonquil saw the little formless excrescence. What? I'm ruining the moment. Excrescence, yeah. Of the face-down canvas. Little bluish yellow paws hauling the assemblage forward in big, balanced, oblong shape with its rim of gilt vaguely shining, machine-like, primeval, a mutated tortoise. It pulled itself on, and as the frame scraped along the floor, it screamed toward Jonquil in the doorway. Jonquil slammed shut the door. She turned and caught up things, the inflatable bed, the table, and stuffed them up against the doorway. And the mechanical tortoise screamed twice more and struck against the door, and the door shook. Jonquil turned round and round in her trap as the thing outside thudded back and forth, and her flimsy barricade trembled and tottered. Listen, I mean, I get that this is spooky, but it's also a painting. You could probably just kick it. Kind of like when there's like a big, there's like a baby tottering around and it's got a knife and it's gonna kill you. Just kick it really hard. There was no other exit but the window. She got it open and ran on to the balcony, which creaked and dipped. The weed was there, the bluish-green Venus weed, which choked the whole city. Jonquil threw herself off into it. As she did so, the door of the room gave way. She was half climbing, half rebounding, and falling down the wall of the house. Everywhere was darkness, and below the sucking of the water at the pavement. As she struggled in the ropes of weed, tangled, clawing, a shape reared up in the window above her. Jonquil cried out. The painting was in the window, but something comically macabre, had happened. In rearing, it had caught at an angle between the uprights of the shutters. It was stuck, could not move out or in. Jonquil hung in the weed, staring up at Jonina in her frame of gilt and wood and plaster and night. How soulless she looked. How without life. Then a convulsion went over the picture. Like a blue amoeba touched by venom, it writhed and wrinkled. It tore itself free of the golded frame. It billowed out, still held by a few filaments and threads, like a sail, a veil, the belly of something swollen with the hunger of centuries. And Jonquil fought and dropped the last 2 meters from the weed, landing on the pavement hard in the box of darkness that was the city. She was not dreaming, but it was like a dream. It seemed to her she saw herself running. The engine of her heart drove her forward. She did not know where or through what she ran. There was no moon, there were no lights. A kind of luminescence filmed over the atmosphere, and constructions loomed suddenly at her, an arch, a flight of steps, a platform, a severed wall. She fell and got up and ran on. And behind her, that came, that which had ripped itself from an oblong of gilding. It had taken to the air. It flew through the city, between the pillars and under the porticos, along the ribbed arteries carrying night. It rolled and unrolled as it came, with a faint soft snapping, and then it sailed wide open, catching some helpful draught, a huge pale bat. It's flying now, Jesus Christ. Weed rushed over Jonquil, and she thought that thing which had been called Jonina had settled on her lightly, coaxingly, and she screamed. The city filled with her scream like an empty gourd with water. There were no lights, no figures huddled in smoldering fires, no guards or watchmen, no villains. No one here to save her, no one even to be the witness of what must come. When her young heart finally failed, her legs buckled, when the sailing softness came down and covered her, stroking and devouring, caressing and eating, its tongues and fingers and the whole porous mouth that it was, to drink her away and away. Jonquil ran. She ran over streets that were cratered as if by meteorites, through vaulted passages, beside the still waters of night and death. it occurred to her, her stunned and now almost witless brain, to plunge into the lagoon, to swim towards the unseen towers. But on the face of the mirror, gentleness would drift down on her, and in the morning mist, not even a ripple. The paving tipped. Jonquil stumbled, ran, downwards now, hopeless and mindless, her heart burning a hole in her side. Down and down, cracked tiles spinning off from her feet, down into some underground place that must be a prison for her, perhaps a catacomb, to stagger among filigree coffins, where the water puddled like glass on the floor, no way out, down into despair, and yet, mockingly, there was more light to see what she did not want to see. It was the phosphorus of the death already there, the mummies in their narrow homes. Yes, she saw the water pools now as she splashed through them. She saw the peculiar shelves and cubbies, the stone statue of a saint, barnacled by the sea rot the water brought into a creature from another world. And she saw the wall also that rose prematurely from her, the dead end that would end in death, and for which she had been waiting, to which she had run, and where now she collapsed, her body useless, run out. She dropped against the wall and, in the coffin light, turned and looked back, and through the descending vault a pale blue shadow floated, innocent and faithful, coming down to her like a kiss. I don't believe this, Jonquil would have said, but now she did. And anyway, she had no breath even to scream again or cry. She could only watch, could not take her eyes off the coming of the feaster. It had singled her out, allowed her to bring it from the chest. With others it had been more reticent, hiding itself. Perhaps it had eaten Johannes too. Before he had been forced to secure it against the witch-hunting servants. Or maybe Johannes had not been to its taste. How ravenous it was, and how controlled it was its need. It alighted 5 meters from her, from Jonquil. As she lay against the death-end wall, she saw it down an aisle of coffins. Touching the water on the floor, it rolled together and furled open and skimmed over the surface on the stone. She was fascinated now. She wanted it to reach her. She wanted it to be over. She dug her hands into the dirt, and a yellow bone crumbled under her fingers. The painting of Nina was crawling ably along the aisle. There was no impediment, no heavy frame to drag with it. Sweat slipped from Jonquil's eyes, and for a moment she saw a blue woman with ivory hair walking slowly between the coffins, and there was something catching at her robe, and she hesitated to try to pluck the material away. Jonquil blinked. She saw a second movement behind the limpid roll of the Venus skin, a flicker like a white handkerchief, and then another. Something darted, and it was on the painting, on top of it, and then it flashed and was gone, and then 2 other white darts sewed through the blueness of the shadow, bundling it up into an ungainly lump, and 2 more, gathering and kneading. The painting had vanished. It was buried under a pure white jostling, and there began to be a thin high note on the air, like a whistling in the ear, without any emotion or language. 10 white rats of the catacombs had settled on the painting, and with their teeth and busy paws they held it still and rent it in pieces, and they ate it. They ate the painting image of the Venus, Nina, and her background of mountains and sea. They ate the living, shrieking membrane of the flesh. Their hunger, too, had been long unappeased. Jonquil lay by the wall watching until the last crumb and shred had disappeared into dainty, needled mouths. It did not take more than 2 or 3 minutes. Then there was only a space, nothing on it, no rats, no other thing. Get up, Jonquil said. There was a low singing in her head, but no other noise. She stood in stages and went back along the aisle of dead. She was very cold, feeble, and sluggish. She thought she felt old. She walked through the water pools. She had a dreadful intimation that everything had changed, that she would never be the same, that nothing ever would, that survival had sent her into an unknown and fearful world. A rat sat on a coffin overseeing her departure, digesting in its belly blueness and alien dreams. The walls went on crumbling particle by particle. Silence flowed over the city like the approaching sea. What the fuck was that? I'm disappointed. Miss Painting was murdered by rats of all things. Come on. She crawled out of, she was full the ring girl. Like, that takes a lot of work. Let her kill the other human. What the fuck was that story? It was long too, right? Like, I'm not crazy. I felt like it lasted forever. A lot longer than the other two, at least. God. Okay, that was Venus Rising on Water by Tanith Lee, who has apparently written plenty of vampire stories. So if you really liked that, check her out. I don't know. If they all end in a happy note, I'll be disappointed. Just kick the painting next time. Okay, that was our live for the night. Thank you for getting all the way to the end. I really appreciate it. I'd like to do these every Sunday at 6 Eastern Standard Time. Maybe I'll see you next week. Bye.